This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I never thought my first solo road trip to college would turn into the most terrifying day of my life. Looking back, I still can't believe I made it out alive. It was a sunny August morning when I packed up my beat-up Honda Civic and hit the road. I was beyond excited to start my freshman year, even though the 8-hour drive to campus made me a bit nervous. My parents had wanted to come along, but I insisted on doing this on my own. I was 18 after all, an adult ready to prove my independence. The first few hours went smoothly. I jammed out to my favorite playlists and munched on snacks, feeling pretty good about handling this long drive by myself. Around the 5-hour mark, I noticed my gas tank getting low. The GPS showed a gas station coming up in about 10 miles, so I figured I'd stop there to fill up and grab some coffee. As I pulled off the highway, I immediately got an uneasy feeling. The exit ramp led to a narrow 2-lane road surrounded by dense forest. There were no other buildings or cars in sight, just an old run-down gas station sitting alone in a small clearing. I hesitated for a moment, but my fuel gauge was flashing empty. I didn't have much choice, so I pulled up to one of the pumps. The place looked deserted at first, but then I noticed an old pickup truck parked on the side of the building. As I got out to pump gas, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being watched. I tried to shake off the paranoia, telling myself I was just on edge from driving so long. I had just finished filling up when I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I spun around to see a scruffy-looking older man walking towards me. He was tall and thin, with wild gray hair and a scraggly beard. His clothes were dirty and torn. "You shouldn't be out here all alone, son," he said in a gravelly voice. I froze, unsure how to respond. My heart was pounding. He came closer, his eyes darting around nervously. "These roads ain't safe, especially after dark. You best be careful and watch your back." Thanks for the advice," I stammered. "I'll keep that in mind." The man nodded grimly. "There's bad folks round these parts. They prey on young folks like yourself passing through. You do well to get back on the highway and don't stop again till you reach the city." With that ominous warning, he turned and shuffled back towards the store. I quickly got in my car and peeled out of there, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. As I merged back onto the highway, I tried to calm myself down. The old man was probably just some local weirdo trying to scare me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. I drove for another hour or so, the shadows growing longer as evening approached. The highway was fairly empty, with only the occasional passing car. I was starting to relax a bit when I noticed a beat-up SUV gaining on me fast in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, figuring they'd just pass me. But as they got closer, I realized there were at least 3 or 4 men inside, and they seemed to be pointing at my car. My pulse quickened as the SUV pulled right up on my bumper. I sped up, pushing my old Honda as fast as it would go. But the SUV matched my speed, staying right on my tail. Panic set in as I realized this wasn't just some aggressive driver. They were actually pursuing me. The old man's warning echoed in my mind. I searched desperately for an exit or somewhere to turn off, but there was nothing but empty road ahead. Suddenly, the SUV swerved into the left lane and pulled up beside me. I caught a glimpse of the men inside. They all looked rough and mean, with shaved heads and tattoos. The passenger was leaning out the window, waving what looked like a gun and yelling something I couldn't make out over the rush of wind. My blood ran cold. This was really happening. These weren't just some rowdy guys messing with me. They meant to do me harm. Images flashed through my mind of all the horrible things they might do if they caught me. Running purely on adrenaline and instinct, I made a split-second decision. Just as the SUV started to veer towards me to run me off the road, I slammed on my brakes. The sudden move caught them off guard. Their vehicle shot past me, tires squealing as the driver tried to correct. I cranked the wheel hard and veered onto the grassy median, then cut back across to the opposite lanes. Horns blared as I narrowly avoided oncoming traffic. In my mirror, I saw the SUV fishtailing as it tried to turn around to follow me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely control the car, but somehow I managed to floor it. I weaved in and out of traffic, pushing my little Civic to its limits. Each time I checked my mirrors, the SUV seemed a little farther behind. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, I finally lost sight of them. But I didn't slow down or relax. I kept driving like a maniac, terrified they would catch up at any moment. It wasn't until I saw signs for the college town that I finally let myself breathe. I took the exit and navigated to campus in a daze, still trembling and on high alert. When I pulled into the dorm parking lot, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a ton of bricks. I broke down sobbing, overwhelmed by fear and relief and shock. To this day, I still don't know who those men were or why they targeted me. Were they some kind of gang, human traffickers, just random psychos looking for victims? I reported it to the police, but since I couldn't give many details, nothing ever came of it. That experience changed me profoundly. For months afterwards, I had nightmares and panic attacks. I became hypervigilant, always looking over my shoulder. It took a long time and lots of therapy to feel safe again. I'm sharing this as a warning to others, especially young people traveling alone. The world can be a dangerous place. Trust your instincts, be aware of your surroundings, and have a plan if things go wrong. I was lucky to escape. Others might not be. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices that day. What if I hadn't stopped at that creepy gas station? What if I'd ignored that old man's warning? What if I'd frozen up instead of taking action when they attacked? I'll never know for sure. All I know is that I'm incredibly grateful to have survived. That day could have ended very differently. Now I try to appreciate every moment and live life to the fullest, because I know how quickly it can all be taken away. So, if you're reading this, please be careful out there. The monsters aren't just in movies and campfire stories. Sometimes they're real people, hunting for victims on lonely stretches of road. Stay safe, trust your gut, and never take your safety for granted. You never know when you might find yourself fighting for your life. I'd been working as a food delivery driver for about 6 months at that point. The pay wasn't great, but it helped cover my bills while I finished up my degree. That Friday night started off pretty routine. I'd already made a handful of deliveries around town without any issues. Around 10 p.m., I got an order for a house way out in the countryside, about 20 minutes outside of town. It was a bit unusual to get an order from that far out, but the tip looked decent, so I figured why not. I punched the address into my GPS and started driving. As I got further away from the city, the roads got darker and narrower. There were fewer and fewer houses, until eventually it was just fields and forests on either side. I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. Why would someone order delivery all the way out here? Finally, my GPS told me I'd arrived at my destination. I pulled up to an old farmhouse set back from the road. The place looked completely dark and abandoned, except for a single porch light flickering dimly. I sat in my car for a minute, debating whether I should just turn around and leave. But I really needed the money, and I didn't want to get a bad review. So I took a deep breath, grabbed the food, and walked up to the front door. As I got closer, I noticed the paint was peeling off the walls and some of the windows were boarded up. It didn't look like anyone had lived here in years. My heart was pounding as I rang the doorbell. No answer. I was about to give up when I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming from inside. The door creaked open, and a tall man with stringy gray hair peered out at me. His eyes looked wild and unfocused. Hi there. I have a food delivery for this address," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man just stared at me for an uncomfortably long time without saying anything. Then he broke into a wide, unsettling grin. Yes, come in," he said in a raspy voice. "Bring it upstairs." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there, but I was frozen in place, unsure what to do. I can just leave it here on the porch if you'd prefer," I stammered. "No," the man snapped, his demeanor suddenly changing. "You need to bring it up. 3rd floor." He grabbed my arm and started pulling me inside. I yanked away from his grip and stumbled backwards. "I'm sorry, but I'm not allowed to enter customers' homes," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll just leave the food here." I set the bag down and turned to leave, but the man was suddenly blocking my path. How did he move so fast? "You're not going anywhere," he growled. His eyes looked completely black now in the dim porch light. I don't know where I found the courage, but I shoved past him and sprinted back to my car. I could hear him yelling and chasing after me. With trembling hands, I managed to get my key in the ignition. Just as I was pulling away, I saw the man right outside my window, pounding on the glass. I floored it and sped off down the dark country road. My heart was racing so fast, I thought I might pass out. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified I'd see headlights following me. But there was nothing but darkness behind me. When I finally made it back to a more populated area, I pulled over and called the police. They took my statement and said they'd investigate, but I never heard anything more about it. To this day, I have no idea what that man's intentions were or what might have happened if I'd gone inside. Was he just a harmless eccentric or something much more sinister? I quit my delivery job the very next day. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that house and that man's wild eyes. I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something truly horrific that night. I'll never make another delivery to an isolated house again, that's for sure. The whole experience left me shaken for months afterwards. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was just a confused old man or someone playing a sick prank. But deep down, I know in my gut that there was real evil in that house. I thank my lucky stars that I trusted my instincts and got out of there when I did. I still avoid driving on country roads at night, and every time I see a porch light flickering in the distance, I'm instantly transported back to that terrifying night. Some experiences change you forever, and this was definitely one of them for me. I hope sharing my story might help someone else trust their gut if they ever find themselves in a similar situation. No delivery fee or tip is worth risking your safety. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't ignore those instincts. They might just save your life someday. It was late, around 11 p.m., when I finally hit the road for the 4-hour drive back to my apartment. The highways were mostly empty at that hour, just a few scattered cars here and there. I was tired but feeling good, singing along to the radio and looking forward to sleeping in my own bed. About an hour into the drive, I noticed a white van behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another night driver heading the same direction. But after 20 minutes of the van maintaining the exact same distance behind me, I started to get an uneasy feeling. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help glancing in my rearview mirror every few seconds. The van was always there, matching my speed perfectly. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down too. My heart started racing. This couldn't be a coincidence. I decided to test it by taking the next exit, even though it wasn't on my route. Sure enough, the van followed me off the highway. Now I was in full panic mode. I got back on the highway going the opposite direction, hoping to lose them. But within minutes, I saw those same headlights appear behind me again. How had they caught up so fast? I pushed my foot down on the gas, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The speedometer crept up, 80, 90, 100 mph. But no matter how fast I went, that damn van stayed right on my tail. Tears were streaming down my face at this point. Who were these people? What did they want with me? My mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. I knew I needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere with other people around. But it was the middle of the night in a rural area. Everything was closed. Then I saw a sign for a 24-hour gas station coming up in 5 miles. It was my only hope. Those 5 miles felt like an eternity. I kept expecting the van to ram into me or run me off the road at any second. When the gas station finally came into view, I nearly cried with relief. I screeched into the parking lot and pulled up right in front of the door. There was one employee inside and a single customer at the counter. I leapt out of my car and ran inside, yelling for them to call the police. The van had followed me in and parked a few spaces away. I watched in horror as 3 large men got out and started walking towards the store. They were all dressed in dark clothes with hats pulled low, obscuring their faces. The cashier must have seen the panic in my eyes because he immediately locked the door and picked up the phone. But before he could dial, the men were there, pounding on the glass. "Open up," one of them shouted. "We just need to talk to our friend there. It's nothing to worry about." Friend? I'd never seen these men before in my life. The customer, an older man, looked confused and frightened. "Do you know them?" he asked me. I shook my head frantically. "No, please don't let them in." The cashier hesitated, his hand hovering over the lock. The men outside were getting more agitated, kicking at the door now. "I'm warning you," the same one yelled. "Open this door right now or we'll break it down." I was hyperventilating at this point, certain I was about to die. But then I had a crazy idea. I still had my car keys in my hand. If I could just make it back to my car. Without warning, I sprinted for the door. The cashier, caught off guard, instinctively unlocked it. I burst through just as the men were about to charge in. They were so surprised to see me that I managed to slip past them. I heard angry shouts behind me as I raced for my car. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Just as I started the engine, one of the men slammed into my driver's side door. I stomped on the gas and peeled out of there, the man's furious face inches from my window. I drove like a maniac, constantly checking my mirrors for the van. But somehow, miraculously, they didn't follow. Maybe they thought it was too risky now that people had seen them. I didn't slow down until I reached the nearest police station 30 miles away. I ran inside, still shaking and crying, and told them everything. They took my statement and sent out patrols, but the men in the van were long gone by then. To this day, I have no idea who those men were or what they wanted with me. The police never found any leads. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the pure terror I felt, the sound of fists pounding on glass, the man's rage-filled face pressed against my car window. And I know it was all too real. I don't do long drives alone anymore, especially at night. The fear that it could happen again haunts me. Every white van I see sends a chill down my spine. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. You never know what kind of evil is out there on those dark, empty roads. Stay safe and trust your instincts if something doesn't feel right. It's been years now, but I still have nightmares about that night. In my dreams, I don't make it to my car in time. The men catch me, drag me into their van, and I wake up screaming just as the doors slam shut. I've tried therapy, meditation, everything I can think of to move past the trauma. But a part of me is always on high alert now, always watching for danger. I flinch at unexpected noises. I'm paranoid about locking my doors and windows. Sometimes I find myself wondering what would have happened if things had gone differently. What if I hadn't seen that gas station? What if the cashier had opened the door right away? The possibilities make me sick to my stomach. I've done research, trying to find similar cases or any explanation for what happened, but there's nothing. No pattern of highway abductions in the area, no reports of a creepy white van. It's like those men appeared out of nowhere just to terrorize me, then vanished back into the night. The randomness of it all is almost worse than having answers. I was just a normal person, driving home from a nice family visit. There was nothing special about me, nothing to make me a target. It could have happened to anyone. That's the thought that really keeps me up at night, that there are people out there who will try to hurt you for no reason at all, just because you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I know I'm lucky. I survived. But in some ways, I feel like a part of me died that night on that dark stretch of highway. The carefree, trusting person I used to be is gone forever. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's to always be aware of your surroundings. Don't take your safety for granted. And if you ever get that feeling in your gut that something isn't right, listen to it. It might just save your life. I still don't know why those men were after me or what they would have done if they'd caught me. But I'm grateful every day that I'll never have to find out. All I can do now is try to move forward and not let the fear control my life. But I'll never forget that night, and I'll never stop looking over my shoulder. It started out normal enough. I picked up my load in Phoenix on Tuesday morning and was making good time heading east on I-40. The weather forecast had called for some storms, but I figured I'd be through the worst of it before nightfall. Boy, was I wrong about that. As the sun started to set, the sky turned an ominous dark gray. Within minutes, rain was coming down in sheets. I slowed to about 45 miles an hour, white-knuckling the steering wheel as my wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour. Lightning flashed all around, momentarily illuminating the empty highway stretching out ahead of me. That's when I first noticed the car. At first I didn't think much of it, just another poor soul braving the storm. But after about 20 minutes, I realized it was keeping pace with me, staying about 100 yards back. No matter how I varied my speed, that car maintained the same distance. A chill ran down my spine. In 2 decades of long-haul driving, I'd seen some weird stuff on the road. But something about this felt different, wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as my instincts screamed that I was in danger. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just using me as a guide through the storm. But why not pass me or fall back? Why maintain that precise distance? I kept glancing in my mirrors, trying to make out details of the vehicle. All I could see were headlights, piercing through the rain. This went on for nearly an hour. My nerves were shot. I was jumping at every flash of lightning, every rumble of thunder. My hands were sweating so bad I could barely grip the wheel. I knew I needed to get off the road soon. I was in no condition to keep driving safely. Finally, I saw the glowing sign of a truck stop ahead. I put on my turn signal and started to decelerate. To my horror, the car behind me slowed too, matching my speed perfectly. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I pulled into the truck stop and found a spot near the back of the lot, away from the other rigs. As I started to maneuver into the space, I saw the car pull in behind me, blocking my exit. 3 men got out and started walking purposefully towards my cab. Panic gripped me. Were they going to try to hijack my truck, rob me? Worse, I quickly locked all the doors and scrambled to find anything I could use as a weapon. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this nightmare. The men reached my door. One of them, a tall guy with a scar across his cheek, rapped on the window. "Open up," he shouted. "We need to talk to you." I shook my head frantically. "Go away," I yelled back. "I'm calling the police." The scarred man's face contorted with rage. He started slamming his fist against the window. "Open this fucking door right now, or we'll break it down." The other 2 men joined in, pounding and kicking at my truck. I could hear the metal groaning under the assault. How long before they managed to force their way in? In desperation, I fired up the engine. The men shouted and redoubled their efforts to break in. I threw the truck into reverse, not caring if I hit their car. I just needed to get out of there. As I started to back up, I heard a sickening crunch. My trailer had clipped their vehicle. Good. Serves them right, I thought grimly. I shifted into drive and floored it. My tires squealed as I fishtailed out of the parking spot. In my side mirror, I could see the men scrambling to get back to their damaged car. Heart pounding, I roared out of the truck stop and back onto the highway. Rain was still coming down in buckets. I drove white-knuckled for hours, afraid to stop, jumping at every set of headlights I saw in my mirrors. It wasn't until the sun started to rise that I finally began to relax. Whatever those men had wanted, I'd managed to escape. I pulled over at the next rest area I saw and collapsed into an exhausted sleep in my bunk. When I woke up, the storms had cleared and it was a beautiful sunny day. If it wasn't for the dents and scratches on my cab door, I might have thought I'd dreamed the whole thing. To this day, I have no idea who those men were or what they wanted. Were they trying to steal my cargo, kidnap me? Something even worse? I'll probably never know. I reported the incident to the police, but without much to go on, they couldn't do much. I've talked to other truckers, trying to see if anyone's had similar experiences. So far, nothing. It's been a week now, and I'm back on the road. But things don't feel the same. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if they're out there somewhere, waiting. Every time I see a car following me for too long, my pulse starts to race. I've been driving trucks for most of my adult life. It's not just a job, it's who I am. But now, for the first time, I'm thinking about quitting. The open road doesn't feel like freedom anymore. It feels like a trap, with danger potentially lurking around every bend. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe out here again. But I also don't know how to be anything other than a trucker. So for now, I keep driving. But I've started sleeping with a gun under my pillow in the cab. And I never ever drive at night during a storm anymore. If you're a trucker reading this, or anyone who spends a lot of time on the road alone, please be careful out there. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And remember, no load is worth your life. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night, but I do know one thing for certain. I'll never forget it as long as I live. Stay safe out there, folks. The road can be a dangerous place. I'd been working at Mario's Pizza for about 6 months, mostly to help pay for college. The job was pretty straightforward. Take orders, make pizzas, deliver them. Nothing too exciting. That Friday night started off like any other. It was busy, with lots of orders coming in for the weekend. Around 10 p.m., I got assigned a delivery to an address I didn't recognize. It was way out on the edge of our delivery zone, in a rural area I'd never been to before. The order was for 3 large pepperoni pizzas and some sodas. Pretty standard stuff. I plugged the address into my phone's GPS and headed out. As I drove further from town, the houses got more spread out, and the streetlights became few and far between. After about 20 minutes of driving down increasingly narrow and poorly lit roads, I started to get an uneasy feeling. This didn't seem right. Finally, my GPS told me I had arrived at my destination. I pulled up to what looked like an old farmhouse set way back from the road. There were no lights on that I could see, and the place looked completely abandoned. Weeds and overgrown bushes surrounded the property. A rusty old truck sat in the driveway, covered in vines. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but I had a job to do, and I didn't want to get in trouble for not completing a delivery. So I grabbed the pizzas and drinks and cautiously made my way up to the front porch. The wooden steps creaked ominously under my feet. Paint was peeling off the walls, and cobwebs clung to every corner. My heart was pounding as I reached the front door. I took a deep breath and knocked. At first, there was no response. I was about to knock again when I heard shuffling footsteps from inside. The door slowly creaked open, revealing a pale, gaunt woman who looked to be in her 60s or 70s. Her gray hair was wild and unkempt, and she was wearing what looked like an old nightgown. "Pizza delivery," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman stared at me blankly for a moment. Then a strange smile spread across her face. "Oh yes, come in, dear. We've been expecting you." Every red flag in my mind was going off, screaming at me to get out of there. But before I could react, the woman grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me inside. The interior of the house was dark and musty. What little I could see in the dim light looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Dusty furniture draped in sheets, cobwebs everywhere. That'll be $42.50, I said nervously, wanting nothing more than to complete this transaction and get the hell out of there. The woman's grip on my arm tightened. "Oh no, dear, you misunderstand. We don't want the pizza. We want you." Panic exploded in my chest. I yanked my arm away and stumbled backwards, dropping the pizzas. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw 2 large men emerging from the shadows on either side of me. They were moving slowly, deliberately, like predators stalking their prey. Pure adrenaline kicked in, and I bolted for the door. But one of the men was faster. He grabbed the back of my shirt, nearly choking me as he yanked me backwards. I spun around and swung my fist wildly, connecting with something solid. The man grunted in pain, and his grip loosened. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted for the door, my heart feeling like it was about to burst out of my chest. Behind me, I could hear angry shouts and pounding footsteps. I reached the porch and leapt down the steps, nearly twisting my ankle as I landed. My car was only about 30 feet away, but it felt like miles. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, fumbling for my keys. I could hear them right behind me, their heavy breathing getting closer. Just as I reached my car, a hand grabbed my shoulder. Without thinking, I whirled around and kicked as hard as I could. My foot connected with a knee, and I heard a sickening crack, followed by a howl of pain. I practically dove into my car, slamming the door and locking it in one motion. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life just as one of the men reached my window. He pounded on the glass, his face contorted with rage. I stomped on the gas and peeled out of there, kicking up gravel and dust. In my rear-view mirror, I could see the two men chasing after me on foot for a few seconds before giving up. The old woman stood on the porch, that eerie smile still on her face as she waved goodbye. I sped down that dirt road like a maniac, not slowing down until I reached the main highway. My mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Had I really almost been kidnapped, or worse? When I finally got back to the pizza shop, I was a complete wreck. I burst through the doors, sweating and hyperventilating. My manager took one look at me and knew something was seriously wrong. I managed to stammer out what had happened between gasps for air. He immediately called the police. They took my statement and sent some officers out to the address, but by the time they got there, the place was completely empty. No sign of the old woman or the two men. The house looked like it had been abandoned for years. The police did some investigating but never found any leads. To this day, I have no idea who those people were or what they wanted with me. I quit my job at the pizza place the next day. I still have nightmares about that night sometimes. I don't know if it was some kind of sick prank or if I narrowly escaped something much worse. But one thing's for sure, I'll never make another pizza delivery as long as I live. I'd been working as a food delivery driver for about 6 months, mostly to make some extra cash while going to college. The job was pretty straightforward. Pick up orders from restaurants, drop them off to customers, rinse and repeat. Sure, there were occasional weird encounters or rude customers, but nothing too out of the ordinary. That all changed on a cold Tuesday night in November. It was around 10 p.m., and I was nearing the end of my shift when I got an order for a downtown office building. The address seemed a bit odd for that time of night, but I figured maybe someone was working late. As I pulled up to the building, I immediately felt uneasy. All the lights were off except for a dim glow coming from one of the upper floors. The parking lot was completely empty. I double-checked the address on my phone, hoping I'd made a mistake, but nope, this was the place. I sat in my car for a minute, debating whether to just cancel the order and leave. But I really needed the money, and I didn't want to risk getting a bad review. So I took a deep breath, grabbed the food bag, and walked up to the front entrance. The lobby was dark and silent. My footsteps echoed as I made my way to the elevator. I pressed the call button and waited, my heart starting to race. When the doors opened with a soft ding, I hesitated before stepping inside. As I reached to press the button for the 3rd floor where the customer said to meet, a chill ran down my spine. The elevator ride felt agonizingly slow. When the doors finally opened, I peered out cautiously. The hallway was dimly lit by a few flickering fluorescent lights. All the office doors were closed and dark. "Hello?" I called out nervously. "Food delivery." For a moment there was just silence. Then I heard footsteps approaching from around the corner. A man appeared, tall and thin with graying hair. He was wearing a rumpled suit that looked like he'd been sleeping in it. "Ah, yes, my dinner has arrived," he said with an unsettling grin. His eyes were wide and intense as he stared at me. I forced a polite smile. "Here you go, sir. That'll be $23.50. He made no move to take the food or pay. Instead, he gestured down the hall. "Why don't you bring it to my office? It's just down here." Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, but I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. Oh, that's okay. I can just hand it to you here. His smile faltered for a second. No, no, I insist. Come, it's not far. I reluctantly took a few steps forward. As we walked, I noticed there were no names or numbers on any of the office doors. In fact, they all looked abandoned, covered in a layer of dust. We reached the end of the hallway, and the man opened the last door on the left. The room beyond was pitch black. After you, he said, gesturing for me to enter first. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear myself think. This was wrong. So wrong. I needed to get out of there immediately. Actually, sir, I just remembered I have another delivery waiting. I'll just leave the food here and you can Venmo me the payment. I set the bag down quickly and started backing away. His face contorted with anger. No, you will come inside now. He lunged forward, trying to grab my arm. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard him shouting and his footsteps pounding after me. I sprinted for the elevator, frantically pressing the button. But it was taking too long. I could hear him getting closer. Without thinking, I bolted for the stairwell instead. I flew down the steps, taking them 2 and 3 at a time. I could hear doors slamming above me as he pursued. I burst out of the stairwell into the lobby, gasping for breath. The front doors seemed miles away. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, expecting at any second to feel hands grabbing me from behind. Finally, I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I glimpsed a figure emerging from the building in my rearview mirror. I drove home in a daze, constantly checking to make sure I wasn't being followed. When I finally got to my apartment, I doubled and triple-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, imagining all the horrible things that could have happened if I'd gone into that room. What was waiting for me in there? Why was that man so insistent? The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't bear the thought of making any more deliveries. When I finally worked up the courage to check my work app, I saw that the order from the night before had been canceled. There was no record of it ever existing. Shaken, I decided to do some research on the building. What I found chilled me to the bone. It turned out the place had been abandoned for years after a string of disappearances. Several people had gone missing after being last seen entering that building, never to be heard from again. The cases were never solved. I quit my delivery job that same day. To this day, I can't drive past that building without breaking into a cold sweat. I don't know what would have happened if I'd gone into that room, and I never want to find out. All I know is that I narrowly escaped something truly sinister that night. Sometimes I still have nightmares about it. The flickering lights, the empty hallway, the man's manic grin as he tried to lure me inside. I wake up in a panic, feeling like I'm back there, trapped and alone. I've tried to convince myself that there must be some logical explanation. Maybe it was just a confused old man. Maybe I overreacted. But deep down, I know that's not true. There was true malice and danger in that building. I never reported what happened to the police. Who would believe such a crazy story? And part of me is afraid of what might happen if I start digging into it further. So I've kept it to myself all this time, trying my best to move on and forget. But I can't shake the feeling that I was meant to be another missing person that night, another unsolved case, another victim of whatever evil lives in that abandoned building. By some miracle, I managed to escape, but I know others weren't so lucky. So if you're ever making a late-night delivery to a creepy, empty building, trust your instincts. Don't let politeness or the desire to avoid conflict put you in danger. Be ready to run at the first sign of trouble. You never know what darkness might be lurking behind closed doors waiting for an unsuspecting victim. I still wonder sometimes about that man. Was he real? A ghost? Something worse? And what would I have found if I'd stepped into that pitch-black room? The questions haunt me, but I'm just grateful to be alive to ask them. Stay safe out there, everyone. And maybe avoid food delivery jobs if you can help it. I never thought a simple construction job would turn into the most terrifying day of my life. It started off as a normal Tuesday. I woke up early, grabbed some coffee, and headed to the job site where my dad's company was working on renovating an old office building. As the boss's son, I was trying to prove myself and had been put in charge of overseeing inventory and materials. When I pulled up to the site around 7 a.m., something immediately felt off. There was a beat-up white truck I didn't recognize parked near the back entrance. We weren't expecting any deliveries that early, and all our regular workers drove their own vehicles. A chill ran down my spine as I approached it cautiously. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I circled around it, looking for any company logos or identifying marks, but found nothing. My instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. I debated calling my dad, but I didn't want to seem paranoid over what could be nothing. Instead, I headed inside to do my usual morning routine of checking our supplies and equipment. As soon as I entered the dusty, half-renovated lobby, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was dead silent. No sounds of workers arriving or getting set up for the day. I called out a tentative hello, but got no response. My footsteps echoed ominously as I made my way to our locked storage area. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the padlock had been cut clean through. With shaking hands, I pushed open the door. Boxes were overturned, equipment scattered across the floor. But worst of all, I could immediately tell that thousands of dollars worth of copper wiring and valuable tools were missing. Panic set in as I fumbled for my phone to call the police. But before I could dial, I heard the unmistakable sound of the back door creaking open. Heavy footsteps approached. I looked around frantically for a weapon or hiding place. In my terror, I dove behind a stack of drywall, praying I wouldn't be discovered. The footsteps entered the storage room. I held my breath, too scared to even peek out. I heard grunting and the sounds of more items being moved around. After what felt like an eternity, the intruder left, slamming the door behind them. I waited a few more minutes to be sure they were gone before crawling out of my hiding spot. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled to the door and looked out. The white truck was still there, but now the back was open, and I could see it was loaded with our stolen materials. I knew I had to act fast before they got away. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I snuck out to the parking lot, staying low and using the other vehicles for cover. As I got closer, I could hear someone moving things around in the truck bed. When I was just a few yards away, I finally got a look at the thief. My blood ran cold as I recognized Samuel, one of our longtime employees. He'd worked for my dad for years. I'd known him since I was a kid. I couldn't believe he would betray us like this. I must have made some small sound of shock because Samuel suddenly whirled around. Our eyes locked, and for a moment we both froze. Then he lunged for me with a snarl. I turned to run but tripped over a pile of bricks. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me. Before I could get up, Samuel was on top of me. His hands wrapped around my throat as he hissed, "You shouldn't have come here, kid. I can't let you ruin this for me." I clawed desperately at his arms, gasping for air. Black spots danced in my vision as I started to lose consciousness. In a last-ditch effort, I managed to grab a loose brick and smash it against the side of Samuel's head. He reeled back with a howl of pain, blood streaming down his face. I scrambled away, coughing and sucking in huge gulps of air. Samuel recovered quickly, though, advancing on me with murder in his eyes. "I'll kill you," he growled. "I'll kill you and dump your body where they'll never find it." Pure adrenaline and terror gave me the strength to stumble to my feet and run. I sprinted toward the road, praying a car would pass by. But we were in an industrial area that was nearly deserted this early. I could hear Samuel's heavy footsteps right behind me. Just as his hand brushed my back, reaching to grab me, I veered suddenly to the left. Samuel's momentum carried him past me, and he crashed into a stack of pallets. Taking advantage of his moment of disorientation, I changed course and ran back toward the building. If I could just get inside and lock the doors, maybe I'd be safe until help arrived. My lungs were on fire as I reached the entrance. To my horror, the key stuck in the lock. I jiggled it frantically, on the verge of tears. Come on, I pleaded. Just as the lock finally turned, a meaty hand grabbed the back of my shirt. Samuel spun me around and slammed me against the wall. Stars exploded in my vision as my head cracked against the brick. Through blurry eyes, I saw Samuel pull out a wicked-looking hunting knife. "Nothing personal, kid," he said with an eerie calm. "But I've got debts to pay, and I can't let you or anyone else get in my way." As he raised the knife, I sent up a silent prayer and braced for the killing blow. But suddenly, miraculously, police sirens wailed in the distance. Samuel's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. He looked back at me, clearly weighing his options. The sirens grew louder. With a muttered curse, he shoved me to the ground and took off running toward his truck. I heard tires squealing as he peeled out of the lot. Moments later, 2 police cruisers came flying around the corner, lights flashing. But they were too late. Samuel and the stolen goods were long gone. The rest of the day passed in a blur of police questioning and crime scene investigations. My dad arrived, oscillating between fury at the betrayal and relief that I was okay. He kept hugging me and apologizing for putting me in danger. When I finally got home that night, utterly exhausted, I broke down. The fear and stress of the day hit me all at once, and I sobbed until I had no tears left. Even after a long shower, I still felt dirty, like Samuel's touch had left some lasting taint on me. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Samuel's rage-filled face or felt his hands around my throat. I tossed and turned, jumping at every little sound. It's been weeks now, but I still have nightmares about that day. I can't shake the feeling that Samuel is out there somewhere, waiting for a chance to finish what he started. The police never found him or the stolen goods. My dad beefed up security at all our job sites, and I'm not allowed to be there alone anymore. But it's not enough to make me feel safe. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified I'll see that white truck following me. I don't know if I'll ever fully recover from this trauma. The betrayal of someone I thought I could trust, the violence and greed, it's shaken my faith in humanity. I'm seeing a therapist, but it's a long road ahead. I share this story as a warning to others. Be careful who you trust. Stay alert and trust your instincts when something feels off. You never know when an ordinary day might turn into a fight for your life. I've been a local delivery truck driver for the past 5 years. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and I generally enjoy the work. That particular day started like any other. I woke up early, had my coffee, and headed to the warehouse to start my route. It was a long day of deliveries, and by the time evening rolled around, I was looking forward to finishing up and heading home. I had just one more stop to make in a rural area outside of town. The sun was setting as I drove down the winding country roads, casting long shadows across the fields. As I made the final turn onto a narrow gravel road, I noticed a pickup truck in my rearview mirror. It was still pretty far back, so I didn't think much of it at first. But as I continued down the road, I realized it was getting closer. Fast. Way too fast for these bumpy back roads. My heart rate picked up a bit as the truck got closer and closer. I could see now that it was an old beat-up Ford, probably from the 90s. The headlights were blinding in my mirrors. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, unsure of what to do. Should I pull over and let them pass? But something told me that wasn't a good idea. Suddenly, the pickup swerved into the oncoming lane and pulled up right alongside me. I glanced over and saw 3 guys inside, all wearing baseball caps pulled low over their faces. The passenger leaned out the window and started yelling something, but I couldn't make out the words over the roar of the engines. My adrenaline spiked as I realized this wasn't just some impatient driver trying to pass. These guys were after me specifically. But why? I racked my brain trying to think if I'd cut someone off earlier or done anything to piss someone off, but came up blank. The pickup dropped back behind me again, and then I felt a jolt as they rammed into my back bumper. Holy shit, this was really happening. My hands were shaking as I tried to keep control of the truck. I knew I had to stay calm and think clearly if I was going to get out of this. I started weighing my options. My delivery truck was bigger and heavier than their pickup, which gave me some advantage, but they were more maneuverable on these tight roads. I couldn't outrun them, but maybe I could outsmart them somehow. They rammed me again, harder this time. I saw a dirt access road coming up on the right and made a split-second decision. I yanked the wheel hard and careened onto the bumpy dirt path, praying I wouldn't tip over. The pickup overshot the turn and had to brake hard to follow me. My teeth rattled as I bounced down the rutted road, pushing my truck to its limits. I had no idea where this road led, but anywhere was better than being trapped with those maniacs. In my mirror, I could see the pickup fishtailing as it tried to catch up. Up ahead, the road forked. Without slowing down, I veered left, kicking up a cloud of dust behind me. The pickup hesitated for a crucial few seconds before following. I was starting to put some distance between us. My momentary relief was shattered as I saw headlights appear on the road ahead. Another vehicle was coming towards me. Shit, shit, shit. I flashed my lights frantically, hoping they'd move over. As we got closer, I realized it was a huge farm tractor lumbering down the road. I laid on the horn and swerved to the very edge of the road. We squeezed by each other with inches to spare. In my mirror, I saw the pickup slam on its brakes to avoid hitting the tractor. I used the opportunity to floor it, my engine protesting as I pushed it to the max. The road widened a bit, and I was able to pick up more speed. For a few minutes, I thought I'd lost them. But then I saw those damn headlights appear in my mirror again. By this point, we'd been going for miles down this back road. I had no clue where I was anymore. The fuel gauge was getting dangerously low. I knew I couldn't keep this up much longer. Just when I was starting to panic, I saw lights up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a small town. Thank God. I barreled down the main street, looking desperately for somewhere safe to go. I spotted the local police station and screeched into the parking lot, laying on the horn. The pickup came flying around the corner, but when the driver saw where I was, he slammed on the brakes and peeled out in the opposite direction. Shaking and gasping for breath, I stumbled out of my truck just as a confused-looking deputy came out of the station. It took me a few tries to get the whole story out coherently. The deputy radioed for backup and took my statement. They sent out patrols to look for the pickup but never found it. I spent hours at the station answering questions and giving descriptions. Eventually, they were able to piece together what probably happened. Apparently, there had been reports of a group of drunk guys in a pickup causing trouble in the area that night. The working theory was that they saw my delivery truck and, in their intoxicated state, thought it would be fun to mess with me. The cops seemed to think I was lucky, that the guys probably would have just scared me a bit and then gotten bored if I'd pulled over. But I'm not so sure. The intensity and aggression of the chase makes me think they had something worse in mind. I ended up having to stay overnight in that little town while they processed everything. The next day, my boss sent someone to pick me up and bring me back. He was understanding about the whole thing and gave me a few days off to recover. It's been 2 months now, and I'm back to my normal delivery routes. But I'm a lot more cautious these days, especially on those rural back roads. I'm always checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that old pickup appear behind me. I still don't know for sure what those guys wanted or why they targeted me that night. Maybe it really was just a twisted, drunken game to them, but the fear and desperation I felt during that chase was all too real. I'm just grateful I was able to keep my wits about me and make it out safely. So if you're ever driving late at night and see a vehicle acting suspiciously behind you, don't assume it's nothing. Trust your gut, stay alert, and get to a safe place as quickly as you can. You never know when a routine drive could turn into a life or death situation. At first, I didn't think much of it. Just another delivery to make before I could call it a night. But as I punched the address into my GPS, I realized this one was way out of our usual delivery zone. The house was located deep in the woods, at least 30 minutes from town. I tried to tell my manager we shouldn't take orders that far out, but he just shrugged and said the customer was willing to pay extra for the delivery. So there I was, driving down a dark, winding road into the forest at nearly midnight. The trees loomed on either side, their branches reaching over the road like gnarled fingers. My headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness ahead. I kept telling myself it was just another routine delivery, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. About 20 minutes in, my GPS lost signal. Great. I was now officially lost in the middle of nowhere. I slowed down, peering at the road signs and trying to figure out which unmarked dirt road I was supposed to turn onto. That's when I first heard it, a rustling sound coming from the woods, like something large moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was probably just a deer or something, but my hands tightened on the steering wheel. Finally, I spotted what I thought was the right turnoff. As I steered onto the narrow dirt road, my headlights swept across something that made my blood run cold. For just a split second, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing between the trees, tall and unnaturally thin, with glowing eyes reflecting the light. I slammed on the brakes and stared into the woods, my heart pounding. But there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I sat there for a minute, trying to calm myself down. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me, I told myself. I was tired and on edge from driving in an unfamiliar area at night. Taking a deep breath, I put the car back in drive and continued on. The dirt road seemed to go on forever, twisting deeper into the forest. The trees pressed in close on both sides, branches scraping against my windows. I was starting to think I'd made a wrong turn when I finally saw a light up ahead. As I got closer, I could make out a small, run-down cabin. This had to be the place. I pulled up in front of the cabin and grabbed the pizza from the passenger seat. As I got out of the car, the silence of the forest struck me. It was unnaturally quiet. No crickets chirping, no wind in the trees, just dead silence. I hurried up to the front door, eager to complete the delivery and get the hell out of there. I knocked and waited, shifting nervously from foot to foot. After what felt like an eternity, I heard slow, shuffling footsteps approaching from inside. The door creaked open, and I found myself face to face with an ancient-looking old man. His skin was pale and wrinkled, his eyes sunken and cloudy. He stared at me without saying a word. Pizza delivery," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The old man's gaze drifted down to the pizza box in my hands, then back up to my face. A thin smile spread across his lips, revealing yellowed teeth. "Yes, of course," he said in a raspy whisper. "Please come in. I'll get your money." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. So I stepped inside, telling myself I was being ridiculous. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by a single oil lamp. The walls were lined with shelves full of old books and strange objects I couldn't identify. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay. The old man shuffled over to a desk in the corner and began slowly counting out cash from a small wooden box. As I waited, I noticed something odd about the room. There was no furniture aside from the desk, no chairs, no bed, nothing. Who could live like this? My eyes were drawn to one of the shelves, where a collection of old photographs sat. I squinted, trying to make out the images in the dim light. They appeared to be pictures of young men and women, all with terrified expressions on their faces. A chill ran down my spine. "Here you are," the old man said suddenly, making me jump. He was standing right beside me, though I hadn't heard him approach. He held out a handful of crumpled bills. I quickly counted the money, not even caring if it was the right amount. I just wanted to leave. "Thanks," I muttered, already backing towards the door. "Have a good night." The old man's thin smile widened. "Oh, I'm sure I will," he said. "Drive safely now. These woods can be dangerous at night." I practically ran back to my car, my heart racing. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard a sound that made me freeze. Footsteps in the woods behind me. Heavy footsteps, moving fast, and they were getting closer. I yanked the door open and dove inside, slamming it shut and locking it in one motion. Through the rearview mirror, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. Something large and dark was emerging from the forest, but I didn't stick around to get a better look. I gunned the engine and peeled out, tires spitting gravel. As I sped down the dirt road, I kept glancing in my mirrors, convinced I was being followed. The trees seemed to bend towards the car, branches clawing at the windows. I swear I could hear something running alongside the car, just out of sight in the darkness. When I finally reached the main road, I nearly cried with relief. I didn't slow down until I was back in town, surrounded by the comforting glow of streetlights. As I pulled into the pizza shop parking lot, I was shaking so bad I could barely turn off the ignition. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to collect myself. Had all of that really happened? Maybe I had just freaked myself out and imagined the whole thing. Yeah, that had to be it. I was letting my imagination run wild. But as I got out of the car, I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. There were deep scratches all along the driver's side door, like something with huge claws had tried to get in while I was driving. I ran my fingers over the gouges in the metal, my mind reeling. This was real. This had actually happened. I called my manager and told him I was done for the night. There was no way in hell I was making any more deliveries. I drove home in a daze, jumping at every shadow. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat up in bed with all the lights on, terrified of what might be lurking in the darkness outside my window. It's been weeks since that night, but I still have nightmares about it. I quit my job at the pizza place, and I refuse to drive anywhere after dark now. Sometimes when I'm alone, I swear I can hear those heavy footsteps following me, and every time I look in the mirror, I expect to see that old man's creepy smile reflected back at me. I don't know what happened out there in those woods, or what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. But I do know one thing. I'm never making another delivery to a remote cabin in the forest again. Some pizzas just aren't worth the risk. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights suddenly illuminated something large blocking the lane ahead. I slammed on my brakes, tires screeching as I came to an abrupt stop just feet away from a semi-truck parked sideways across both lanes. The truck's hazard lights weren't on, and there were no flares or warnings set up. It was just sitting there silently in the darkness, like some giant beast lying in wait. My heart was racing from the near collision. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as I tried to process what I was seeing. Why would a truck just be parked in the middle of the road like that? I peered through my windshield, but couldn't see any sign of the driver or what might have caused them to stop. After a minute or two of debating what to do, I decided I should at least check if the driver needed help. I grabbed my phone and flashlight from the center console and cautiously got out of my car. The silence was eerie as I walked towards the truck, my footsteps crunching on the gravel shoulder. I shined my light into the cab, but it was empty. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" No response, just dead silence except for the faint buzzing of insects in the surrounding forest. An uneasy feeling began creeping over me. Something about this whole situation felt very wrong. I walked around to the other side of the truck, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. That's when I noticed fresh tire tracks leading off the shoulder and into the woods. It looked like another vehicle had veered off the road not too long ago. My instincts were screaming at me to just get back in my car and leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what was going on. I followed the tracks a short way into the trees, pushing through some bushes as I went deeper into the forest. About 50 feet in, my light fell on the mangled wreck of a car wrapped around a large oak tree. The front end was completely crushed and the windshield was shattered. My breath caught in my throat as I moved closer, dreading what I might find inside. To my relief, the car appeared to be empty. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The driver's side door was wide open, and there were drag marks in the dirt leading away from the vehicle. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I followed the trail with my flashlight. The drag marks went on for another 30 feet or so before abruptly stopping. And that's where I saw it, a large, dark stain soaking into the forest floor. Even in the dim light, I could tell it was blood, a lot of blood. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but I felt frozen in place. What the hell happened here? Where was the driver? A twig snapped somewhere behind me and I whirled around, nearly dropping my flashlight in panic. The beam of light danced wildly across the trees as my trembling hands struggled to hold it steady. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" For a long moment there was only silence. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush, coming closer. I backed away slowly, my eyes straining to see into the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows between two trees about 20 feet away. It was a man, stumbling slightly as he walked. As he got closer, I saw that his clothes were torn and covered in dark stains. His face was scratched and bruised, but it was his eyes that truly terrified me. They had a wild, feral look to them, darting around frantically before locking onto me. A chill ran down my spine as our gazes met. Are you okay?" I managed to stammer out. "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. He just kept walking towards me with that unnerving stare. As he got closer, I could see that what I had thought were dark stains on his shirt were actually huge patches of wet blood. It was smeared all over his hands and face, too. I started backing away faster, my heart racing. "Stay back!" I yelled, holding my flashlight out in front of me like a weapon. "Don't come any closer." He didn't slow down. If anything, his pace quickened. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted back towards the road. I could hear him right behind me, his ragged breathing getting closer. I burst out of the tree line and raced towards my car, fumbling for my keys. Just as I reached for the door handle, a hand grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. I found myself face to face with the blood-covered man, his wild eyes boring into mine. "You shouldn't be here," he growled in a low, menacing voice. "You need to leave. Now." Before I could react, he shoved me hard against my car and took off running down the road. I watched in shock as he disappeared into the darkness. For a moment, I just stood there, paralyzed with fear and confusion. Then I snapped out of it and scrambled into my car, locking the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I threw the car in reverse and floored it, tires squealing as I backed up and swerved around the abandoned truck. I sped off down the highway, constantly checking my rearview mirror to make sure I wasn't being followed. It wasn't until I was several miles down the road that I finally slowed down and tried to process what had just happened. Who was that man? What happened in those woods? Should I call the police? In the end, I decided not to report it. I had no proof of anything illegal, and the whole experience was so surreal I wasn't even sure I could explain it coherently. But I'll never forget that night or the terrifying encounter in the woods. To this day, I have no idea what really happened out there on that lonely stretch of highway. But sometimes when I'm driving late at night, I find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see those wild eyes staring back at me from the darkness. The incident haunted me for weeks afterwards. I had trouble sleeping, constantly replaying the events in my mind and imagining what could have happened if things had gone differently. Every time I drove that stretch of road, my heart would start racing, and I'd grip the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I scoured local news reports, looking for any information about accidents or crimes in the area that might explain what I saw. But there was nothing. It was like the whole thing never happened. A part of me wondered if I had imagined it all, if the stress and fatigue of driving late at night had caused me to hallucinate. But I knew deep down that it was real. The fear I felt that night was too visceral, too intense to have been a figment of my imagination. I became obsessed with trying to piece together what might have transpired in those woods. Was the bloody man the driver of the wrecked car? If so, how did he survive such a severe crash? And what about all that blood at the scene? Surely no one could lose that much and still be walking around. Maybe he wasn't the driver at all. Could he have been responsible for whatever happened to the real driver? The thought made me sick to my stomach. I considered going back to investigate in the daylight, but fear always held me back. What if he was still out there? What if I stumbled upon something even worse? As the weeks turned to months, the intensity of the memory began to fade. I was able to sleep through the night again and drive that road without having a panic attack. But I never forgot. How could I? It's been years now since that night, and I still don't have any answers. Sometimes I wonder if I ever will. But one thing's for certain. I'll never look at a deserted highway the same way again. Because now I know that sometimes the real monsters aren't hiding under your bed or in your closet. Sometimes they're out there on the open road, waiting for an unsuspecting traveler to cross their path. I often think about the man I encountered that night. Who was he? What had he been through? In my darkest moments, I imagine him still out there somewhere, wandering the back roads and forests, lost in whatever madness drove him that night. But mostly, I try not to dwell on it. I've accepted that some questions just don't have answers. All I can do is be grateful that I made it out of those woods alive, and hope that whatever happened there that night never happens again. Still, on quiet nights when I'm driving alone, I can't help but scan the shoulders of the road, half expecting to see a truck parked sideways or a bloodied figure emerging from the trees, and I always make sure my doors are locked. "Tony's Pizza, how can I help you?" I answered, stifling a yawn. The voice on the other end was raspy and faint, like an old person struggling to speak. They mumbled an address and ordered a large cheese pizza. I had to ask them to repeat it a couple times before I finally understood. The address was way out on the edge of town, in an area I'd never delivered to before. I glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m. We were supposed to stop taking orders at midnight, but my boss always said to never turn down a sale. I wrote down the info and got to work making the pizza. As I drove out to make the delivery, an uneasy feeling started creeping over me. The roads got narrower and more run down the further I went. Potholes rattled my old beater car. Thick trees crowded in on both sides, their branches scratching against my windows. The streetlights became fewer and far between until I was driving in almost total darkness. I double-checked the address, hoping I'd made a wrong turn somewhere. But nope, the GPS said I was heading the right way. After what felt like an eternity of driving down this creepy back road, I finally saw a mailbox with the house number I was looking for. I pulled into the long gravel driveway, my headlights illuminating an old Victorian-style house looming ahead. Paint was peeling off the siding and several of the windows were boarded up. But weirdly, the yard was meticulously manicured, neatly trimmed hedges, not a weed in sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I got out of the car, pizza in hand. Something about this place just felt off. But I figured the faster I made the delivery, the faster I could get out of there. I strode up to the front porch, my footsteps creaking on the old wooden boards. I rang the doorbell and waited. No answer. I rang again and knocked, calling out, "Pizza delivery." Still nothing. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned and saw an old man standing at the edge of the yard, partially hidden behind a tree. He was rail-thin, practically skeletal, wearing a tattered bathrobe, but it was his face that made my blood run cold. His eyes were huge and bulging, staring right at me with this crazed, hungry expression. A wide grin stretched across his face, revealing rows of yellow teeth. I froze, unable to look away from those terrible eyes. The old man took a jerky step towards me, his movements unnatural and twitchy. That snapped me out of my daze real quick. I dropped the pizza box and booked it back to my car as fast as I could. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back at the house. The old man was nowhere to be seen. but I swear I saw a face peering out from one of the boarded-up windows, pale and gaunt, with those same bulging eyes. I peeled out of there, gravel flying as I gunned it down the driveway. I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell had I just experienced? Who was that old man, and why did he look at me like that? And who or what was in that house? When I got back to the pizza shop, I was a mess. My coworker Mark took one look at me and asked what was wrong. I tried to explain what happened, but it all came out in a jumbled rush. Mark just laughed it off, saying I'd probably just spooked myself and imagined things. But I know what I saw. That old man, those eyes. It wasn't natural. I quit my job at Tony's the next day. I couldn't handle the thought of potentially making another delivery out to that house. It's been a few months now, and I still get chills thinking about that night. I've tried researching the address, but I can't find any information about who lives there. Part of me wants to go back in the daytime and see if the place really exists, but a bigger part of me never wants to set foot on that property again. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stuck around longer that night, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never look at a late-night pizza order the same way again. The creepiest part, a couple weeks after it happened, I was talking to my friend who works at another pizza place across town. I didn't tell him about my experience, but he mentioned they'd had a weird order recently. An old man called late at night and ordered a pizza to be delivered to a house on the outskirts of town. The driver got there and no one answered, but he saw someone watching him from the shadows. It was the exact same address. I didn't tell my friend what had happened to me. I just nodded and changed the subject. But inside, my mind was reeling. What is going on at that house? Why are they ordering pizzas and then vanishing? And most importantly, what do they want with the delivery drivers? I still live in this town, but I avoid that area like the plague now. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I'll catch a glimpse of those glowing eyes in my rearview mirror. But when I look again, they're gone. Just a trick of the light, I tell myself. But deep down, I know better. Whatever's in that house is real, and it's still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting delivery driver to show up at their door. I've thought about reporting it to the police, but what would I even say? I saw a creepy old guy while delivering a pizza. They'd laugh me out of the station. And honestly, I'm afraid of what might happen if I start poking around. What if whoever, or whatever, is in that house decides to come after me? So I keep my mouth shut and try to forget. But every time I smell pizza now, I'm right back on that dark porch, staring into those hungry eyes. I don't think I'll ever truly be able to shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something terrible that night. To anyone reading this, be careful out there. And if you're a delivery driver, trust your gut. If a place feels off, it probably is. Don't end up like me, jumping at shadows and lying awake at night, wondering what's lurking in the darkness. I don't know if I'll ever get answers about what really happened that night. Part of me hopes I never do. But I know one thing for certain. I'm never eating Tony's pizza again. It was already dark when I arrived, having gotten a late start due to unexpected traffic. The temperature had dropped drastically, and a biting wind cut through my jacket as I hurried from my car to the front door, luggage in tow. The house was charming enough from the outside, a small rustic cabin surrounded by towering pine trees. But as soon as I stepped inside, an inexplicable feeling of unease washed over me. I tried to shake it off as I explored the space, telling myself I was just on edge from the long drive. The interior was cozy, with a fireplace in the living room and a small but well-equipped kitchen. I unpacked quickly, eager to settle in for the night. After a simple dinner of microwaved leftovers I'd brought along, I curled up on the couch with a book, relishing the silence after weeks of city noise. Just as I was starting to relax, a sharp rap on the window made me jump. My heart racing, I cautiously approached and peered out into the darkness. To my shock, there was a woman standing there, her face eerily illuminated by the porch light. She looked distressed, gesturing urgently for me to open the door. Against my better judgment, I cracked the door open slightly. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please," she gasped. "My car broke down a mile back. Can I use your phone to call for help?" Something about her story didn't sit right with me. Why would she walk a mile in this freezing weather instead of staying with her car? And how did she even know someone was staying here? The Airbnb was set far back from the main road. "I'm sorry," I replied, "but I don't feel comfortable letting you in. There's a town about 15 minutes down the road. You can get help there." Her expression changed in an instant, from pleading to cold anger. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the darkness. I quickly shut and locked the door, my hands shaking. Unable to shake my growing sense of dread, I double-checked all the locks and drew the curtains tight. I tried to return to my book, but couldn't focus on the words. Every creak of the old house made me flinch. Around midnight, I decided to try and get some sleep, hoping I'd feel better in the morning. I had just drifted off when a loud thud jolted me awake. For a moment, I lay frozen in bed, straining my ears. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to force the front door open. Panic surged through me as I scrambled out of bed, frantically searching for a weapon. I grabbed a heavy lamp from the bedside table and crept towards the living room, my heart pounding so hard I was sure the intruder could hear it. The rattling at the door grew more intense. I could hear grunting and muffled curses as whoever it was threw their weight against the wood. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and I knew the door frame was starting to splinter. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I raced to the kitchen, snatching my car keys from the counter. The back door was closer, and I figured it was my best chance at escape. As I fumbled with the lock, I heard the front door finally give way with a resounding crash. Heavy footsteps pounded through the house as I burst outside, not even bothering to close the door behind me. The bitter cold hit me like a slap to the face, but I barely noticed as I sprinted towards my car. Just as I reached for the door handle, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I whirled around, swinging the lamp with all my might. There was a sickening thud as it connected with something solid, followed by a howl of pain. I didn't wait to see who I'd hit. I dove into the car, locked the doors, and peeled out of the driveway as fast as I dared on the icy road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, terrified I'd see headlights gaining on me. But the road behind remained dark and empty. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the next major city. Only then did I pull over and call the police, my voice trembling as I recounted what had happened. They took my statement and said they'd send officers to investigate, but warned me that without any real evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I ended up checking into a hotel for the rest of the night, too shaken to continue driving. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman's face at the window, heard the sound of the door splintering. The next morning, I gave another statement to the local police before finally heading home. They told me they'd found signs of forced entry at the Airbnb, but no other evidence of the intruders. The owners were just as baffled, swearing nothing like this had ever happened before. It's been months now, and I still haven't fully processed what happened that night. Was it a planned robbery gone wrong? Or something even more sinister? The thought that the woman and the intruder might have been working together still makes my blood run cold. I've tried researching the area, looking for any similar incidents, but have come up empty. Part of me wants answers, but another part is terrified of what I might discover if I dig too deep. All I know is that I'll never stay in another Airbnb again, especially not in some isolated small town. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd let that woman in, or if I hadn't woken up in time to escape. The possibilities haunt my nightmares. I'm sharing this as a warning. Trust your instincts, even if it means seeming rude or paranoid. It might just save your life. I still jump at unexpected noises, and I've installed an expensive security system in my apartment. Friends tell me I'm overreacting, that I need to move on, but they weren't there. They didn't feel the sheer terror of being hunted in what was supposed to be a safe place. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly secure again. That one night changed everything, shattered my sense of safety in a way I never thought possible. I'm learning to cope, but the fear is always there, lurking just beneath the surface. All I can do is be vigilant and hope that someday the memory of that horrifying encounter will fade. It was a really nasty night, pouring rain and wind howling. I remember thinking how glad I was to be inside as I did my usual rounds. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting in the security office, half dozing off, when I heard this weird scraping sound coming from somewhere in the warehouse. At first I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or something, but then I heard it again, louder this time. My heart started racing as I pulled up the security camera feeds on the monitors. I scanned through them quickly, not seeing anything out of the ordinary at first. But then on one of the feeds from the back storage area, I saw movement. I leaned in closer, squinting at the grainy black and white image. There was definitely someone there, skulking between the shelves of inventory. I felt a cold sweat break out all over my body. This wasn't supposed to happen. In the year I'd worked there, we'd never had an actual break-in. I wasn't prepared for this. I grabbed my flashlight with shaking hands and radioed to let the security company know I was investigating a potential intruder. They told me to be careful and that they were sending backup, but it would take at least 20 minutes for anyone to get there. I knew I should probably just wait it out in the office, but something compelled me to go check it out myself. Maybe it was misplaced bravado, or maybe I just couldn't believe it was really happening. Either way, I found myself creeping through the dimly lit warehouse, straining my ears for any sound. The rain pounding on the metal roof made it hard to hear anything else. I made my way to the back storage area, sweeping my flashlight beam across the rows of shelves. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the light steady. Suddenly, I heard fast footsteps to my left. I swung around, heart pounding out of my chest. The beam of my flashlight landed on a man about 50 years old, with wild eyes and dirty clothes. He looked as startled to see me as I was to see him. For a second, we both just froze, staring at each other. Then I saw the glint of metal in his hand. He was holding a large knife. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that before in my life. It was like my whole body turned to ice. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The man's eyes darted around like he was looking for an escape route. I managed to find my voice and yelled, "Don't move! Security!" That seemed to snap him into action. He lunged towards me, knife raised. I scrambled backwards, nearly falling over my own feet in my panic. I turned and ran, not even looking where I was going. I could hear his footsteps pounding after me. I don't know how, but I made it back to the security office and slammed the door shut, fumbling to lock it with trembling fingers. I collapsed into the chair, gasping for breath, my heart feeling like it was going to explode out of my chest. On the security monitors, I could see the man prowling around, clearly agitated. He tried a few doors, then made his way back to where he'd broken in. I watched in disbelief as he slipped out through a small window he'd somehow managed to pry open. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, but by then he was long gone. They took my statement and dusted for fingerprints, but they never found the guy. I quit that job the next day. No way was I going back there after what happened. For weeks afterwards, I had terrible nightmares about that night. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like I was back in that warehouse with that crazed man chasing me. Even now, months later, I still get anxious in dark or enclosed spaces. The worst part is not knowing who he was or why he was there. Was he just looking to steal something? Or did he have more sinister intentions? I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to get away from him. I've gone over that night in my head 1,000 times, wondering if I should have done something differently. Should I have tried to confront him? Should I have just stayed in the office and waited for backup? I don't know. All I know is that I'm lucky to have made it out of there unharmed. Sometimes I think about trying to track down information about similar break-ins in the area to see if I can figure out who the guy was. But then I remember the look in his eyes, that wild, desperate look, and I decide it's better not to know. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. I still have trouble sleeping some nights. I'll wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I heard that same scraping sound from the warehouse. It takes me a while to calm down and remember that I'm safe in my own home. I've thought about going to therapy to deal with the lingering anxiety and fear, but I'm worried they'll think I'm crazy or overreacting. I mean, nothing really happened, right? I got scared, but I wasn't hurt, so why can't I just get over it? But then I remember the glint of that knife in the beam of my flashlight and the sound of his footsteps chasing me through the dark warehouse, and I know it's not something I'll ever fully get over. That night changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I guess I'm sharing this as a warning to other night security guards out there. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and don't take unnecessary risks. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows. And to anyone else who's been through something similar, you're not alone. The fear and anxiety are real, and it's okay to struggle with them. I'm still working on healing, but I'm getting there day by day. I don't know if I'll ever feel completely safe in the dark again, but I'm trying to focus on the positives. I survived. I'm okay. And I learned how strong I can be when faced with real danger. It's not much, but it's something to hold on to on the nights when the memories come flooding back. So that's my story. Thanks for listening. It feels good to finally share it with someone who might understand. Stay safe out there, everyone. It was just a regular Tuesday. I had the day off work and decided it was finally time to get rid of my old desktop PC that had been collecting dust in the corner of my apartment for years. I snapped a few photos, wrote up a brief description, and listed it on Craigslist for $200 or best offer. Within an hour, I got a message from a guy named Cameron who said he was interested. We exchanged a few messages and agreed to meet up at my place around 6 p.m. so he could check out the computer. I didn't think twice about giving him my address. I'd done plenty of Craigslist deals before without any issues. As 6 p.m. approached, I tidied up a bit and set the computer up on the kitchen table so it would be ready for Cameron to look at. But 6 p.m. came and went with no sign of him. I figured he was just running late, so I waited around for another 30 minutes. Still nothing. I sent him a message asking if he was still planning to come by. No response. By 7 p.m. I was starting to get annoyed. I shot off one last message telling him to let me know if he wanted to reschedule, then went about my evening. It was around 9 p.m. when things started to get weird. I was watching TV in the living room when I heard what sounded like footsteps on the gravel outside my apartment. My place is on the ground floor of a small complex, so I'm used to hearing neighbors come and go. But this was different. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet. I muted the TV and listened closely. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started up again, this time right outside my living room window. My heart started racing. I slowly got up and peeked through the blinds, half expecting to see Cameron standing there. But there was no one, just the empty parking lot illuminated by a flickering streetlight. I let out a sigh of relief and chuckled at myself for being so paranoid. It was probably just a neighbor taking out the trash or something. I settled back onto the couch, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. A few minutes later, I heard a car engine start up. I looked out the window again and saw an old sedan idling in the parking spot directly across from my unit. The windows were tinted so I couldn't see inside, but I had a sinking feeling someone was watching me. The car sat there for what felt like an eternity. Every few minutes the engine would rev slightly, like the driver was getting impatient. I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? There's a suspicious car in the parking lot. They'd probably think I was crazy. Finally, after about 20 minutes, the car pulled out of the lot and drove off. I breathed a huge sigh of relief, but my relief was short-lived. Not even 5 minutes after the car left, I heard a loud thud from the back of my apartment, like something heavy had been dropped. I froze, straining my ears. Then came the unmistakable sound of my back door slowly creaking open. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone and ran to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. With shaking hands, I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I tried to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me officers were on the way and told me to stay on the line. As I huddled in the corner of my room, I could hear soft footsteps moving around my apartment, drawers opening and closing, things being moved around. Then silence. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew whoever it was hadn't left. The silence was almost worse than the noise. My imagination ran wild with thoughts of what they might be doing. After what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes, I heard sirens in the distance. The intruder must have heard them too, because suddenly there was a flurry of movement, rapid footsteps, the back door slamming, then the sound of someone running through the grass behind my building. When the police arrived, they did a thorough search of my apartment and the surrounding area, but found no sign of the intruder. Nothing appeared to be stolen, though several drawers had been rifled through. The officers took my statement and said they'd increase patrols in the area, but ultimately there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. I was rattled, but tried to convince myself it was just a random break-in attempt. I changed the locks the next day and installed a security system. For a few days, things seemed to go back to normal. But then the nightmares started. Every night, I'd jolt awake in a cold sweat, convinced someone was in my room watching me sleep. I'd turn on the lights, heart pounding, only to find the room empty. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadowy figures darting just out of sight. More than once, I could have sworn I saw someone staring at me through the window, only for them to vanish when I looked directly. The final straw came about a week after the break-in. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I was washing my hands, I glanced up at the mirror and my blood ran cold. There, reflected in the glass, was a man standing in the doorway behind me. I whirled around, but the doorway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. But I knew what I had seen. The next day, I broke my lease and moved in with a friend across town. I never went back to that apartment, not even to get the rest of my stuff. I had my friend pack up my things and bring them to me. It's been a month now, and I still have trouble sleeping. I jump at every unexpected sound. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced I'm being watched. I never did sell that computer. It's sitting in a storage unit now, along with the rest of my stuff from the old apartment. Part of me wants to just throw it away and be done with it. But another part of me is terrified that if I do, whoever was after it will find me again. I don't know who Cameron really was or what he wanted. I don't know if he was working alone or if there were others involved. All I know is that my life has been completely upended by a simple Craigslist ad, and I'm not sure I'll ever feel truly safe again. So let this be a warning to anyone selling stuff online. Be careful who you give your information to. You never know who might be on the other end of that message. And if someone doesn't show up for a scheduled meeting, trust your gut and be on high alert. It could save your life. I live alone in a 2-story apartment with my dog, Milo. He's a 5-year-old golden retriever, and he's been my best friend since I got him as a puppy. That night, I was working late on my laptop in the living room downstairs. It was around 11 p.m., and I was just about ready to call it a night and head up to bed. Milo had been acting a bit strange all evening. He kept pacing around and whining softly, which wasn't like him at all. I figured maybe he just needed to go out, so I took him for a quick walk around the block. But even after we got back, he seemed on edge. As I was shutting down my computer, I heard a faint noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like rustling or shuffling, almost like someone was moving around up there. My heart started racing immediately. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or the neighbors, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. I called out hesitantly, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response, just more soft shuffling noises. Milo's ears perked up and he started growling low in his throat, staring intently at the staircase. That's when I really started to panic. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I whispered to the dispatcher that I thought someone was in my apartment. They told me to stay on the line and that officers were on the way. Those next few minutes felt like hours as I huddled on the couch with Milo, straining to hear any more noises from upstairs. Suddenly, I heard the distinct creak of a floorboard, the one right outside my bedroom door that always squeaks when you step on it. There was no doubt now, someone was definitely up there. I was terrified but also furious that some stranger was in my home, invading my personal space. Against my better judgment, I decided I needed to confront whoever it was. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and slowly started making my way up the stairs, with Milo right by my side. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the bat. Every step felt like it took an eternity. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw that my bedroom door was closed. I knew I'd left it open earlier that day. Taking a deep breath, I reached out and turned the doorknob as quietly as I could. Milo was growling softly, the fur on his back standing straight up. I flung the door open, brandishing the bat and shouting, "Get out of my house!" And there he was, a man crouched in the corner by my window. He looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and wearing dark clothes. The window was open, and I realized with horror that he must have climbed in from the fire escape. For a moment, we just stared at each other in shock. Then he lunged towards me, trying to push past to get to the stairs. I swung the bat wildly, more out of fear than any real intent to hit him. Milo started barking furiously and snapping at the man's legs. In the chaos, I lost my balance and fell backwards, dropping the bat. The intruder shoved past me and bolted down the stairs. I scrambled to my feet and chased after him, yelling at the top of my lungs. Milo was right on his heels, barking the whole way. Just as the man reached my front door, there was a loud pounding from outside. "Police! Open up!" I've never been so relieved to hear those words in my life. The intruder froze for a split second, then tried to run back towards the stairs. But Milo blocked his path, snarling and showing his teeth. I flung open the door, and 2 officers rushed in, quickly subduing the man and putting him in handcuffs. It was all over in a matter of seconds. I collapsed onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline wore off. Milo came over and started licking my face, whining softly. The next few hours were a blur of giving statements, answering questions, and watching the police dust for fingerprints all over my apartment. They told me the man was a known burglar who had been breaking into homes in the area. Apparently, he'd been watching my apartment and waiting for an opportunity when I was out. What haunts me the most is realizing how long he might have been in my home before I noticed. Had he been lurking up there for hours while I worked obliviously downstairs? The thought makes my skin crawl. The police said there was evidence he'd rifled through my closets and drawers, probably looking for valuables to steal. I couldn't sleep in my apartment for weeks after that. I stayed with a friend until I could install a better security system and new locks on all the windows. Even now, months later, every little noise at night sets me on edge. I find myself constantly checking and rechecking that all the doors and windows are locked. Milo has become even more protective since that night. He sleeps right by my bedroom door and goes on high alert at the slightest unusual sound. In a way, his vigilance is comforting, but it's also a constant reminder of what happened. The hardest part is not knowing how long that man was in my home before I realized. Was he watching me? What would have happened if I'd gone to bed without noticing he was there? The questions keep me up at night, replaying the what-ifs over and over in my mind. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. Always trust your instincts and your pets. If something feels off, it probably is. I'm so grateful that Milo sensed the danger and that I listened to his warnings. I shudder to think how differently things could have turned out if I'd ignored his strange behavior that night. This experience has changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'm more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, but I'm also more appreciative of the safety I used to take for granted. Every night when I lock up and set the alarm, I say a little prayer of thanks that I'm here, safe in my home with Milo by my side. I know logically that the likelihood of something like this happening again is slim. The man who broke in is in jail now, and I've taken every precaution to secure my home. But there's a part of me that will always be looking over my shoulder, always listening for that telltale creak of a floorboard or rustle of movement where there shouldn't be any. In sharing this story, I hope others will learn from my experience. Don't ignore those gut feelings when something seems off. And most importantly, cherish the safety and security of your home. It's something I'll never take for granted again. We arrived at the campsite late Friday afternoon. It was a secluded spot nestled in a dense forest, about a 3-hour drive from Seattle. As we set up our tents and gathered firewood, I remember feeling so at peace. The trees were ablaze with autumn colors, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. As night fell, we got a fire going and cracked open some beers. Mike and I spent hours catching up and swapping stories under the stars. It was exactly the kind of chill night we'd been looking forward to. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. I'm not sure what time it was when I first heard it, maybe 2 or 3 a.m. A twig snapping, followed by the crunch of leaves. At first, I figured it was just an animal, but then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps circling our campsite. My heart started racing. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint where the sounds were coming from. Suddenly, a beam of light swept across my tent. Someone was out there with a flashlight, peering in at us. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, hardly daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the light moved on. I heard more footsteps, then silence. I must have eventually dozed off, because the next thing I knew, early morning sunlight was filtering through the tent walls. For a moment, I wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing. But when I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my blood ran cold. There, just beyond our campsite, was a man. He was standing absolutely still between 2 trees, staring right at me. He was too far away to make out clearly, but something about his stance seemed off, unnatural. I blinked, and in that split second, he was gone. I woke Mike up and told him what happened. He was skeptical at first, suggesting maybe I'd seen a hunter or another camper, but I could tell he was unsettled too. We decided to shake it off and stick to our plans for a day hike. As we hit the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. Mike noticed my unease and tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but his laughter sounded forced. About 2 miles in, we came to a small clearing with a breathtaking view of the surrounding mountains. We paused to take some photos. That's when I saw him again, the same man from that morning, standing at the tree line on the far side of the clearing. This time, Mike saw him too. We both froze, staring. The man took a single step forward, emerging from the shadows. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in ragged clothes that seemed too light for the chilly weather. But it was his face that made my skin crawl. It was blank, expressionless, almost like a mask. His eyes were fixed on us with an unblinking intensity. Neither of us said a word. We just turned and started walking quickly back the way we came. I glanced back once to see the man following at a steady pace, never quite catching up but never falling behind either. By the time we made it back to our campsite, we were both badly shaken. Mike suggested we pack up and leave early, and I wholeheartedly agreed. But as we approached my car, my stomach dropped. All 4 tires had been slashed. Panic set in as we realized how vulnerable we were. The nearest town was miles away, and we had no cell service. We started grabbing whatever we could carry, planning to hike out to the main road and try to flag down help. That's when we heard it, whistling. A cheery, upbeat tune that felt horribly out of place. It was coming from just beyond the campsite, getting closer. We ran. There was no discussion, no plan, just pure survival instinct kicking in. We plunged into the woods, pushing through branches and scrambling over fallen logs. I could hear the whistling behind us, never seeming to get farther away no matter how fast we ran. I don't know how long we kept going. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like lead. Suddenly, Mike's foot caught on a root, and he went down hard. I skidded to a stop and turned back to help him up. That's when I saw a flicker of movement through the trees, that pale, emotionless face. Fueled by a fresh surge of adrenaline, we took off again. The woods eventually started to thin out, and I caught glimpses of what looked like a road through the trees. We burst out of the forest onto the shoulder of a 2-lane highway, gasping for breath. A car was approaching. We waved our arms frantically, and thankfully it slowed to a stop. It was an older couple who looked alarmed at our disheveled state. We babbled out an explanation and begged for a ride to the nearest town. They hesitated, eyeing us warily, but must have seen the genuine fear in our eyes. They agreed to take us. As we pulled away, I looked back at the woods. There was no sign of our pursuer. Had we imagined it all? But the raw terror I felt was all too real. We filed a report with the local sheriff, but they seemed skeptical. They said they'd send someone to check out the campsite, but I doubt anything came of it. Mike and I ended up renting a car for the drive back to Seattle. We barely spoke the whole way, both lost in our own thoughts. It's been weeks now, and I still have nightmares about that expressionless face in the woods. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some crazy hermit messing with us. But deep down, I know it was something more. Something not quite human. I haven't been camping since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear faint whistling outside my window. And I wonder, did we ever truly escape those woods? Or did something follow us home? I still can't shake the feeling of dread when I think back to that camping trip in Colorado last summer. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, just me and nature. I'd found this secluded spot deep in the woods, miles from any towns or other campsites. The perfect place to decompress and clear my head, or so I thought. The first day was great. I hiked, fished in a nearby stream, and set up my tent as the sun started to set. As darkness fell, I got a campfire going and settled in with a book, enjoying the peace and quiet. That's when I first heard it, a faint mumbling sound coming from somewhere in the woods. At first I figured it was just the wind or some animal, but as it got louder, I realized it was definitely a human voice. I called out, thinking maybe it was another camper who'd gotten lost. No response, just more indistinct muttering. It was starting to freak me out a little. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it towards the sound, sweeping the beam across the trees. That's when I caught a glimpse of him, a man standing about 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a large oak tree. He was tall and thin, wearing dirty, ragged clothes. But what really chilled me was the way he was swaying back and forth, talking to himself and gesturing at the air around him. I yelled out again, asking if he needed help. He snapped his head in my direction, staring right at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Then he grinned, this huge, unsettling smile that showed all his teeth. Without a word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. I was seriously spooked at this point. Part of me wanted to pack up and get the hell out of there. But it was the middle of the night. I was miles from my car, and I had no idea which direction that guy had gone. I told myself he was probably just some harmless vagrant or maybe a mentally ill person who'd wandered away from somewhere. I decided to stay put, but I made sure my hunting knife was within reach as I tried to get some sleep. Big mistake. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of someone moving around outside my tent. My heart was pounding as I heard footsteps circling, getting closer and closer. Then a shadow fell across the side of the tent. Someone was right there, inches away on the other side of the thin fabric. I could hear ragged breathing and more of that creepy muttering. I grabbed my knife and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, then burst out, ready to defend myself. And there he was, the man from earlier, standing right in front of me with that same huge, unnerving grin. Up close I could see how gaunt and dirty he was. His eyes were bloodshot and seemed to look right through me. "What do you want?" I demanded, brandishing the knife. He didn't react at all, just kept smiling and mumbling unintelligibly. I caught a few words here and there, something about the voices and almost time. Then he started slowly walking towards me, arms outstretched. I backed away, warning him to stay back. He kept coming. In a panic, I swung the knife, catching him across the arm. He didn't even flinch as blood started running down his sleeve. That's when I truly realized how much danger I was in. This guy wasn't right in the head and didn't seem to feel pain. Who knew what he was capable of? I turned and ran, sprinting through the dark woods as fast as I could. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me. My lungs were burning and branches were whipping my face, but pure adrenaline kept me going. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I realized I couldn't hear him pursuing me anymore. I stopped to catch my breath, straining my ears for any sound of him. Nothing but normal nighttime forest noises. Had I lost him? I wasn't taking any chances. I kept moving, picking my way carefully through the trees, trying to find my way back to my campsite so I could grab my stuff and get out of there. It took me ages to find my way back in the dark. The whole time I felt like eyes were watching me from the shadows. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves had me jumping. When I finally spotted the glow of my dying campfire through the trees, I nearly cried with relief. I rushed to my tent, determined to pack up and hike out immediately, screw waiting for daylight. But as I approached, my blood ran cold. The strange man was there, sitting calmly by my fire. He looked up as I emerged from the trees, that unnerving smile still plastered on his face. "Welcome back," he said softly. "I've been waiting for you." I was frozen in terror. How had he beaten me here? Had he been toying with me this whole time? What do you want from me?" I stammered. He cocked his head to the side like a curious dog. "Want? Oh, I don't want anything. I'm just the messenger. They sent me to prepare the way." "Who sent you? Prepare for what?" I was backed up against a tree, gripping my knife so hard my knuckles were white. He stood up slowly. "You'll see soon enough. They're almost here. Can't you feel it?" He spread his arms wide and tilted his head back, eyes closed. The air is humming with their approach. The trees are trembling in anticipation. I had no idea what the hell he was talking about, but the absolute conviction in his voice terrified me. This guy truly believed whatever insane delusion he was spouting. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know who you are or what's going on, but I'm leaving now. Don't try to stop me." His eyes snapped open and locked onto mine. "Oh, you can't leave. Not now. You have to be here to greet them." He started walking towards me again. I brought up the knife. "Stay back. I swear I'll use this." He didn't even seem to notice the blade. "It's okay," he said soothingly, like he was talking to a scared animal. "There's no need to be afraid. They've chosen you. You should be honored." Before I could react, he lunged forward with shocking speed and grabbed my wrist, twisting until I dropped the knife. His grip was like iron. I struggled and kicked, but he barely seemed to notice. He started dragging me towards the center of the clearing. "No!" I screamed. "Let me go!" Suddenly the whole forest seemed to go silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just total oppressive quiet. The man stopped, his head tilted like he was listening to something. "Ah," he said softly. "They're here." A low humming filled the air, quickly growing in volume. The trees around us started to sway and bend, though there was no wind. Leaves and debris began swirling around us in a vortex. And then I saw it, a blindingly bright light descending from above the treetops. I squeezed my eyes shut, certain this was it. I was about to be abducted by aliens or sacrificed to some eldritch horror, or who knows what else. I waited for something, anything, but nothing happened. After a few moments, I cautiously opened my eyes. The light was gone. The forest sounds had returned to normal, and the strange man had released my arm. He was just standing there, staring up at the sky with a look of rapturous joy. "Beautiful," he whispered, "even more glorious than I imagined." Then he looked at me, that unsettling grin back on his face. "Thank you for your hospitality. I do apologize for frightening you. That wasn't my intention. I hope you'll understand someday." And with that, he turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the shadows between the trees. I stood there for I don't know how long, trying to process what the hell had just happened. Part of me wanted to believe it had all been some kind of hallucination or vivid nightmare. But I knew deep down it had been real. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my stuff and got the hell out of there. I've never gone camping again. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, that man's face vivid in my mind. I don't know who or what he was, or what would have happened if that light hadn't appeared. All I know is that I never want to experience anything like that ever again. It was November 1st, the day after Halloween. I was home alone, relaxing after a fun night of handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. My husband was out of town on a business trip, so it was just me and our cat, Mittens. I had settled in on the couch to watch some Netflix and unwind. Around 10 p.m., I heard a noise coming from the front porch. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, a distinct scratching sound at the door. My heart started racing. I muted the TV and listened closely. There it was again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I got up and cautiously approached the front door. Through the peephole, I saw a figure standing on the porch. They were wearing a creepy clown mask, complete with a red nose and wild orange hair. My blood ran cold. Halloween was over. Why would someone still be in costume? The scratching continued. I called out, "Hello, can I help you?" No response, just more scratching. I started to panic. This didn't feel right at all. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. Should I call the police? Was I overreacting? Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door that made me jump. The person in the clown mask was trying to force their way in. I screamed and ran to the kitchen, frantically dialing 911. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's trying to break into my house, I cried. There's a person in a clown mask banging on my front door. The dispatcher tried to calm me down as she took my information. She assured me police were on their way and told me to stay on the line. I was trembling uncontrollably as I hid in the kitchen. The banging at the front door had stopped, but I was terrified the intruder was still out there. Then I heard another sound coming from the back of the house. Oh, God. There was someone else. I peeked around the corner and saw a second masked figure at the back sliding door. This one wore a grotesque zombie mask, its face half decomposed with fake blood and guts hanging off. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I was trapped between two intruders trying to get in. "There's another one," I whispered frantically to the 911 operator. "At the back door, they're wearing masks. Oh God, please hurry." The zombie-masked person was yanking on the back door handle, trying to force it open. I had remembered to lock it earlier, thank goodness. But how long would it hold? I was cornered in the kitchen, shaking and sobbing as I clutched my phone. The dispatcher kept talking to me, telling me to stay calm and that help was almost there. But every second felt like an eternity. The banging at the front door started up again. Between that and the rattling of the back door, the noise was deafening. I covered my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, praying this was all just a horrible nightmare. Mittens came running into the kitchen, clearly spooked by all the commotion. I scooped her up and held her close, burying my face in her fur as tears streamed down my cheeks. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard sirens in the distance. They were getting closer. The masked intruders must have heard them too, because suddenly the banging and rattling stopped. I heard car doors slamming and voices shouting outside. "Police, come out with your hands up." I was shaking so hard I could barely stand, but I managed to make my way to the front door. I opened it to find 2 officers with guns drawn, scanning the area. "Ma'am, are you all right?" one asked. I nodded, still clutching Mittens. They were trying to break in," I stammered. "One at the front, one at the back, both wearing masks." The officers did a thorough search of the property but found no sign of the intruders. They must have fled when they heard the sirens. The police took my statement and dusted for fingerprints, but ultimately there wasn't much physical evidence. I was too terrified to stay in the house alone, so I went to stay with my parents for a few days until my husband got back. Even then, it took weeks before I felt safe in my own home again. We installed a security system and cameras, which helped ease my anxiety a bit. But I still get panicky whenever I hear unexpected noises at night. Halloween decorations that used to seem fun and spooky now fill me with dread. I can't look at masks without getting flashbacks to those terrifying moments. The police never caught the people who tried to break in that night. I don't know if it was a targeted attack or just a random act of violence. Part of me wonders if they were high on drugs and got carried away with some twisted idea of extending Halloween. But I'll probably never know for sure. All I know is that my sense of safety and love for Halloween were shattered that night. I'm sharing my story as a warning to others. You can never be too careful, even in your own home. I'm grateful the police arrived when they did. Who knows what might have happened if those masked intruders had gotten inside. I still have nightmares about clown and zombie masks. Mittens sleeps in bed with me now. Her presence is comforting on the nights when every little sound makes me jump. My husband tries to reassure me that we're safe, but it's hard to shake that feeling of vulnerability. Logically, I know the chances of something like that happening again are slim, but the fear lingers. I find myself double and triple checking the locks. I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings, always on edge. They say time heals all wounds, but I'm not sure I'll ever fully recover from the terror of that night. The image of those masks peering in at me is seared into my memory. All I can do is try to move forward, one day at a time, and hope that sharing my story might help someone else stay safe. So please, be vigilant. Trust your instincts if something doesn't feel right, and maybe think twice about answering the door to masked strangers, even on Halloween. You never know who might be hiding behind that mask. I set out in the afternoon, hiking deeper into the woods than usual. I wanted to find a new spot, somewhere I hadn't camped before. As the sun started to set, I realized I had gone much farther than intended. The trees all started to look the same in the fading light, and I couldn't get my bearings. Panic started to set in as darkness fell. My phone had no signal out here, and I cursed myself for not bringing a compass. I stumbled through the undergrowth, hoping to find a familiar landmark. That's when I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. A house. I felt a surge of relief, thinking I could ask for directions or use a phone. As I got closer, I saw it was an old 2-story farmhouse, paint peeling and shutters hanging crooked. It looked abandoned, but there was definitely a light on inside. I approached cautiously, leaves crunching under my feet. The porch steps creaked as I climbed them. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with an ominous creak. "Hello?" I called out, stepping inside. "Is anyone home? I'm lost and need help." The interior was musty and looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. But there was a lamp lit in what looked like the living room. How could that be in an abandoned house? I heard a floorboard creak upstairs and froze. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking. Footsteps, coming down the stairs. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot. 2 men appeared at the bottom of the staircase. They looked to be in their 40s, dressed in dirty flannel shirts and jeans. Their eyes locked onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Well, well," one of them said, his voice raspy. "What do we have here?" I'm sorry," I stammered. "I got lost in the woods. I saw the light and thought someone could help me." They exchanged a look that made my blood run cold. The taller one grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Oh, we'll help you all right, boy. Why don't you come upstairs with us?" Every fiber of my being screamed danger. I backed towards the door. "That's okay. I'll just be going. Sorry to bother you." The shorter man lunged forward with surprising speed. I turned to run, but he grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "You're not going anywhere," he growled. Adrenaline surged through me. I twisted violently, breaking free of his grasp. I bolted for the door, hearing them shout behind me. I flew down the porch steps and into the woods, branches whipping my face as I ran blindly through the darkness. I could hear them crashing through the underbrush behind me, getting closer. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but terror kept me going. I spotted a large fallen tree and dove behind it, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. The sound of their pursuit faded. Had I lost them? I stayed perfectly still, straining my ears. Minutes ticked by in agonizing silence. Then I heard a twig snap nearby. They were still out there searching. I don't know how long I huddled there, shaking with fear and cold. It felt like hours. Eventually, I heard no more sounds of them. Dawn was breaking through the trees. I cautiously stood up, muscles screaming in protest. Somehow, miraculously, I recognized where I was. In my panic, I had run in the right direction. I made it back to my dad's house just as he was waking up. He was furious that I had been out all night, but his anger turned to concern when he saw the state I was in. Clothes torn, scratched and bruised, wild-eyed with fear. I told him everything. He called the police immediately. They went out to investigate but found nothing. The old farmhouse was there, but it was completely abandoned. No sign anyone had been there in decades. The officers said there was no way the electricity could have been working for a light to be on. I know what I saw. Those men were real. The terror I felt was real. But how could they have vanished without a trace? It's been months now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling those men's eyes on me. I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there in those woods, waiting. I'll never go camping alone again. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But deep down, I know the truth. Something inexplicable and terrifying happened to me that night. And the scariest part is not knowing who those men really were or what they wanted with me. Sometimes I find myself staring out at those woods, wondering, are they still out there? Will they come for me again? The questions haunt me. I don't think I'll ever have answers. All I know is that I came face to face with true evil that night, and it changed me forever. I've searched online for similar stories, hoping to find some explanation. I've found a few accounts of hikers encountering strange figures in abandoned buildings, but nothing quite like my experience. It's like those men appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. The police did a thorough search of the area in the following weeks. They found no evidence of anyone living in or even visiting that old farmhouse. The dust was undisturbed, no footprints, nothing. They even checked missing persons reports, thinking maybe the men were fugitives or something, but there was nothing. My dad suggested that maybe I had gotten so scared and disoriented that I had imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw and felt. The grip of that man on my arm, the malice in their eyes. It was all too real. I've tried to move on with my life, but the incident has left its mark. I'm jumpier now, always looking over my shoulder. I have trouble sleeping, and loud noises make me flinch. My friends have noticed the change in me, but I can't bring myself to tell them the full story. They'd think I was crazy. Sometimes I wonder if I am crazy. Did I somehow conjure up this terrifying experience in my mind? But then I look at the scars on my arms from the branches that whipped me as I ran, and I know it was real. I've become obsessed with researching the history of those woods and that old farmhouse. I've spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspapers and town records. The house was built in the late 1800s and abandoned in the 1950s when the last owners died. There's no record of any violent incidents or mysterious disappearances associated with it. But there are local legends about those woods, stories of hikers going missing, of strange lights seen at night, of eerie sounds echoing through the trees. Most people dismiss them as campfire tales, but now I'm not so sure. I've thought about going back, trying to find that house again in the daylight. But every time I even consider it, a paralyzing fear grips me. What if they're still there, waiting? What if this time I don't escape? So here I am, sharing my story, hoping that someone out there might have answers, or at least that someone might believe me. Because the not knowing is the worst part. Not knowing who those men were, what they wanted, or if they were even human at all. All I know is that something impossible happened to me that night in those woods, and I'll never be the same because of it. So if you're ever hiking or camping and come across an abandoned house with a light on inside, my advice is this: run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because you never know what kind of nightmare you might be walking into. The rain had been relentless for hours, pounding against my windshield as I navigated the winding forest roads. My wipers were working overtime, but they could barely keep up with the downpour. The darkness seemed to close in around me, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning. I'd been driving for about 12 hours at that point, and fatigue was starting to set in. The monotonous sound of rain and the hypnotic sway of the trees was making it hard to stay alert. I decided to pull over at the next rest stop to grab some coffee and stretch my legs. As I rounded a bend, my headlights illuminated a figure on the side of the road. It was a man, drenched from head to toe, frantically waving his arms. My first instinct was to keep driving. It was the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the exhaustion clouding my judgment, or maybe it was that nagging voice telling me I'd want someone to stop if I was stranded out here. I pulled over, leaving the engine running and the headlights on. As I rolled down my window, the man rushed over. "Oh, thank God," he exclaimed. his voice barely audible over the rain. "My car broke down a mile back, and I've been walking for hours. Could you give me a lift to the next town?" I hesitated. He seemed genuinely distressed, but something felt off. His clothes were soaked through, but they looked expensive. And despite claiming he'd been walking for hours, he wasn't nearly as disheveled as he should have been. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to sound sympathetic but firm. "I can't give you a ride, but I'd be happy to call for help when I reach the next town." His face fell, and for a split second, I saw something dark flash in his eyes. "Please," he insisted, his tone shifting from desperate to demanding. "I just need to get to my car. It's not far from here." Alarm bells were ringing in my head now. I started to roll up my window, but he grabbed the frame, preventing it from closing. I said, "I need a ride," he growled, all pretense of friendliness gone. Heart pounding, I slammed on the gas pedal. The tires spun in the wet gravel before finding purchase, and the car lurched forward. The man's grip on the window broke, and he stumbled back. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. As I accelerated down the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw headlights flick on behind me. He had a car, after all. The next few minutes were a blur of fear and adrenaline. The road was slick with rain, and every curve felt like it could send me careening into the trees. But the headlights behind me never faltered, growing closer with each passing second. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. I was miles from civilization, trapped on a deserted road with a madman in pursuit. Suddenly, the car behind me accelerated, ramming into my rear bumper. The impact sent me fishtailing, and it took every ounce of concentration to keep the car on the road. I could hear the man shouting something, but the words were lost in the roar of engines and rain. Another sharp turn loomed ahead. I took it as fast as I dared, praying my pursuer would lose control. As I came out of the curve, I saw something that made my heart leap. Lights in the distance. A gas station. I floored it, pushing my car to its limits. The man behind me must have seen the lights too, because he became even more aggressive, trying to force me off the road. As I neared the gas station, I laid on my horn, desperate to attract attention. The few seconds it took to reach the brightly lit parking lot felt like an eternity. I screeched to a halt right in front of the door, tumbling out of the car and rushing inside. The night attendant looked up, startled by my sudden entrance. "Call the police," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "There's a man. He tried to run me off the road." The attendant reached for the phone, but before he could dial, we heard the screech of tires. Through the window, I saw the man's car speed past the gas station, disappearing into the night. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. I gave them my statement, describing the man and his vehicle as best I could. They promised to keep an eye out, but without more information, there wasn't much they could do. As the adrenaline wore off, the full weight of what had happened hit me. I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. The kind gas station attendant brought me some water and a blanket, insisting I stay until I calmed down. It was nearly dawn by the time I felt steady enough to continue my journey. The police had advised me to stick to main roads and not to stop for anyone. I didn't need to be told twice. The rest of the drive passed in a haze of exhaustion and lingering fear. Every set of headlights made me flinch. Every shadow on the roadside looked like a threat. When I finally reached my sister's house, I collapsed into her arms, unable to speak through my tears. It's been months since that night, and I still have nightmares about it. I've replayed the scenario in my head countless times, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. The police never found the man or his car, and sometimes I worry that he's still out there, waiting for another unsuspecting driver. I know I was lucky. So many things could have gone wrong. I could have crashed. My car could have broken down. I might not have reached that gas station. The experience has left me wary of driving alone, especially at night. I've installed a dash cam in my car and always make sure my phone is fully charged before any trip. But more than anything, it's shaken my faith in humanity. I always thought of myself as someone who would help others in need, but now I drive past any stranded motorists, my doors locked and windows up. I can't shake the feeling that behind every plea for help might be someone with darker intentions. I share this story not to scare anyone, but as a warning. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And please, be careful out there on the roads. You never know who or what you might encounter in the darkness. We had rented this secluded cabin in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from the city. The plan was to spend a few days hiking, relaxing by the fire, and celebrating New Year's Eve with some drinks and music. Nothing crazy, just 3 friends enjoying some time away from the hustle and bustle. We arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon on New Year's Eve. It was a cozy little place nestled in the woods, with a great view of the surrounding mountains. We unloaded our stuff, cracked open some beers, and spent the afternoon just hanging out and catching up. As night fell, we fired up the grill and made some burgers for dinner. Around 10 p.m., we turned on some music and started really getting into the New Year's spirit. We were laughing, dancing, and having a great time. The cabin was pretty isolated, so we weren't too worried about disturbing any neighbors. Boy, were we wrong about that. At around 11:30, there was a loud pounding on the front door that made us all jump. Jason went to answer it, and I'll never forget the look of shock on his face when he opened the door. Standing there was this huge, burly guy with wild eyes and a scraggly beard. He was wearing dirty overalls and looked absolutely livid. Before Jason could even say anything, the guy started yelling at us to turn down the goddamn racket. He was screaming about how we were ruining his New Year's Eve and threatening to shut us up permanently if we didn't quiet down immediately. We were all stunned into silence. Jason, always the diplomat, tried to calm the guy down. He apologized profusely and promised we'd keep it down. The guy just glared at us for what felt like an eternity before finally grunting and stomping off into the darkness. We were all pretty shaken up after that. We turned the music way down and spent the next hour whispering to each other, trying to figure out who this guy was and if we should be worried. There weren't supposed to be any close neighbors according to the rental listing. We debated calling the police, but ultimately decided against it since the guy was gone and we didn't want to cause more trouble. As midnight approached, we hesitantly poured some champagne and prepared to toast the new year. Right as the clock struck 12, we heard a loud crash outside that made us all freeze. We rushed to the window and saw to our horror that the windshield of Christian's car had been completely smashed in. Before we could even process what was happening, we heard another crash as a rock came flying through the cabin's front window. Glass shattered everywhere as we dove for cover. Then came the sound that still haunts my nightmares, gunshots ringing out in the night air. I remember Christian screaming, "He's shooting at us," as we all scrambled to get as low to the ground as possible. The walls of the cabin offered little protection as bullets tore through the thin wood. I was certain we were all going to die. For what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the gunfire continued. I could hear things breaking and shattering all around us as bullets ripped through the cabin. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even think clearly. Then, as suddenly as it started, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We stayed frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe, waiting to see if it would start again. After several agonizing minutes of silence, Jason finally whispered, "Is everyone okay?" Miraculously, none of us had been hit. We were covered in dust and debris from the destroyed cabin, but somehow the bullets had missed us. As the adrenaline started to wear off, I began shaking uncontrollably. Christian was softly crying in the corner. Jason took charge and said we needed to get out of there immediately. We grabbed what we could and made a run for Christian's car, praying the tires hadn't been shot out. The windshield was completely gone, but the car still started. We piled in, and Christian floored it down the gravel road leading away from the cabin. As we sped away into the night, I kept expecting more gunshots to ring out or for someone to start chasing us. But there was nothing, just the sound of gravel crunching under the tires and our ragged breathing. We drove for hours, too scared to stop anywhere. When the sun finally came up, we pulled into a gas station to regroup and figure out what to do. We were all still in shock, covered in cuts and bruises from diving for cover and scrambling through broken glass. We debated going to the police, but we were hours away from the cabin by that point and had no real proof of what had happened. Who would believe such an insane story? In the end, we decided to just go home and try to forget the whole nightmare. But I've never been able to forget. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or why he turned so violently against us. Was he some crazed mountain man? A violent neighbor with a grudge against tourists? I'll probably never know. What I do know is that I came terrifyingly close to death that night. If those bullets had been a few inches in any direction, I might not be here to tell this story. I still have nightmares about the sound of gunshots and shattering glass. Loud noises make me jump. I haven't been able to bring myself to stay in a cabin since then. That New Year's Eve changed me forever. I'm more cautious now, always looking over my shoulder. I appreciate every day I have, knowing how close I came to losing it all. But most of all, I wonder about that man, who he was, why he did what he did, and if he's still out there somewhere in those mountains, waiting for his next victims to arrive. I hope nobody else ever has to experience the terror we did that night. If you're planning a trip to a remote cabin, please be careful. You never know what kind of dangers might be lurking in the darkness beyond. It was a cold, dark winter evening, and I was making my last delivery of the night out in the rural outskirts of town. The roads were icy, and visibility was poor due to a light snowfall. I probably should have called it quits earlier, but I needed the money and figured one more quick run wouldn't hurt. As I drove down the winding country road, my headlights barely cutting through the darkness, I felt my tires start to slip. I tried to correct but overcorrected, sending my car into a spin. Everything happened so fast, the world whirled around me as I careened off the road and down into a ditch with a sickening crunch. When the car finally came to a stop, I sat there for a moment in shock, my heart pounding. I was shaken up but miraculously unhurt. But as I tried to restart the engine, it just sputtered weakly. I was stuck. I called roadside assistance, but they said it would be at least an hour before they could get someone out to me. Great. So there I was, stranded on a lonely back road in the middle of nowhere, in the freezing cold and pitch-black night. I decided to wait it out in my car with the heat on. But after about 15 minutes, I noticed headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. At first, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe someone was stopping to help. But as the vehicle got closer, an uneasy feeling started to creep over me. The car slowed to a crawl as it neared, then came to a stop about 50 feet behind me, headlights still blazing. I waited for someone to get out and come check on me, but nobody did. The car just sat there, idling. After a few minutes of this, I was starting to get seriously creeped out. Why weren't they coming to help? Or if they weren't going to help, why were they just sitting there watching me? I tried to get a better look in my mirrors, but all I could see were those glaring headlights. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something about this felt very, very wrong. Just then, I saw movement. A tall figure emerged from the other car and started walking slowly towards me. In the dim light, I could make out that it was a man, but I couldn't see his face clearly. He was carrying something in his hand, but I couldn't tell what. My heart started racing. Should I lock the doors? Try to drive away? Call 911? Before I could decide, the man stopped about 10 feet from my car and just stood there, staring. I was paralyzed with fear. Who was this guy? What did he want? Why wasn't he saying anything? After what felt like an eternity, he took another step closer. That's when I saw what he was holding. It looked like some kind of tool or weapon. My blood ran cold. In a panic, I fumbled for my phone to call for help, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial. As I glanced back up, the man was even closer now, raising the object in his hand. Just then, another set of headlights appeared, coming down the road fast. The mysterious man quickly retreated back to his car. As the new vehicle approached, I recognized it. It was my dad's truck. I'd called him earlier to let him know I was running late. He must have gotten worried and come looking for me. My dad pulled up and jumped out, rushing over to check on me. I was crying with relief at this point. When I told him about the other car and the creepy guy, he immediately went into protective dad mode. He marched over towards the idling vehicle, yelling, "Hey, what's going on here?" But before he reached it, the car's engine roared to life and it peeled out, speeding off into the night. My dad came back looking concerned. He said he'd caught a glimpse of multiple people in the car and some odd-looking equipment in the back seat. We waited there together until the tow truck arrived. I was still shaken up, but so grateful my dad had shown up when he did. Who knows what might have happened otherwise? To this day, I have no idea who those people were or what they wanted. Were they would-be kidnappers? Thieves looking to rob a stranded driver? Or maybe something even worse? I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes on dark nights I still get chills remembering those glaring headlights and that silent, menacing figure. I don't do late-night deliveries anymore, especially not to rural areas, and I always make sure my car is in good shape before heading out. I know I was lucky that night, but the experience taught me that you can never be too careful out there. You never know what or who might be lurking on those lonely back roads after dark. The whole thing left me shaken for weeks afterwards. I had trouble sleeping and kept replaying the events in my mind, imagining all the terrible what-ifs. What if my dad hadn't shown up? What if I'd gotten out of the car? What if they'd managed to grab me? I couldn't shake the image of that tall, shadowy figure slowly approaching my car. The way he moved was so deliberate, so predatory. And that object in his hand, was it a weapon? A tool to break into my car? I'll never know for sure. The police took a report, but without much to go on, they couldn't do much. They said it was probably just some drunk guys messing around, but I'm not so sure. The whole thing felt too calculated, too menacing to be a random prank. I found myself jumping at every little sound for weeks after. Nighttime became something to dread rather than enjoy. Even now, months later, I still feel uneasy when I'm out alone after dark. The experience changed me in other ways too. I became much more cautious and aware of my surroundings. I started taking self-defense classes and carrying pepper spray. Maybe it's paranoid, but I never want to feel that helpless and vulnerable again. I also developed a new appreciation for my family, especially my dad. If he hadn't decided to come check on me that night, I don't even want to think about it. We've always been close, but now our bond is stronger than ever. I don't take those relationships for granted anymore. Sometimes I wonder about those people in the car. Who were they? Where did they go? Have they done this to others? The thought that they might still be out there preying on unsuspecting victims haunts me. I've tried to find meaning in what happened, to see it as a wake-up call or a learning experience. But honestly, some days I just wish I could forget the whole thing ever happened, to go back to feeling safe and carefree like I did before. But I know that's not possible. That night changed me forever. It opened my eyes to the darkness that can lurk just out of sight, waiting for an opportunity. It taught me that the world can be a dangerous place, even in seemingly safe, familiar settings. I still work as a delivery driver, but I'm much more selective about when and where I'll go. No more late-night runs to isolated areas. No more pushing through bad weather just to make a few extra bucks. It's not worth the risk. I've thought about quitting altogether, finding a safer line of work. But part of me doesn't want to let fear dictate my life choices. So I keep driving, keep delivering. But now I do it with my eyes wide open, always alert, always prepared. I hope sharing my story might help others stay safe out there. Trust your instincts. Be aware of your surroundings. Have a plan in case something goes wrong. And never, ever take your safety for granted, because you never know when a routine night might turn into a nightmare, when the headlights in your rearview mirror might belong to someone who means you harm, when the difference between safety and danger might come down to a split-second decision. I was lucky that night. My story had a happy ending, thanks to my dad's timely arrival. But I know not everyone is so fortunate. So please, be careful out there. Stay safe. And if you ever find yourself in a situation that doesn't feel right, trust that feeling and get out of there fast. As for me, I'm still processing what happened that night, still trying to make sense of it all. But mostly, I'm just thankful. Thankful to be here, to be safe, to have another chance, and determined to never take that chance for granted again. It was a quiet Tuesday night around 2 a.m. I was halfway through my shift and fighting to stay awake, idly scrolling on my phone behind the counter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and I could hear the hum of the refrigerators in the back. It was dead silent otherwise. We hardly ever got customers this late on weeknights. I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard the electronic chime as the front door opened. A man walked in, tall and thin with dark hair. He was wearing jeans and a plain black t-shirt. Nothing particularly remarkable about him, but something felt off. He didn't look at me or acknowledge me in any way, just started slowly walking up and down the aisles, looking intently at everything. I kept my eyes on him as he made his way around the store. He wasn't picking anything up, just methodically scanning every shelf and corner. After a few minutes of this, he abruptly turned and walked out without buying anything or saying a word. As soon as he left, I felt my whole body relax. I hadn't even realized how tense I'd gotten. Something about that guy just radiated bad vibes. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Plenty of weirdos came in late at night. It was probably nothing. About 20 minutes later, I heard a car pull up outside. I glanced at the security camera feed and my stomach dropped. It was the same guy, getting out of an old blue sedan. But this time he wasn't alone. Another man got out of the passenger side. They stood by the car for a minute, talking in low voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying. I started to get seriously freaked out. Why would that guy come back so soon, and with a friend? Were they going to rob the place? Should I call the cops? I was trying to decide what to do when they both walked in. The first guy nodded at me this time as they entered. "Evening," he said casually. I mumbled a greeting back, my mouth dry. They started doing the same slow lap around the store that the first guy had done earlier. I noticed the second man was shorter and stockier, with a shaved head. He had on cargo shorts and a ratty t-shirt. As they made their way around, I saw them pointing things out to each other and whispering. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone, ready to dial 911 at a moment's notice. They weren't actively doing anything threatening, but every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong. Just as they were nearing the counter, I heard sirens in the distance. The two men froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. Before I could react, they bolted for the door. I ran out from behind the counter, following them outside. They were sprinting towards their car when two police cruisers came screeching into the parking lot, lights flashing. "Stop! Police!" an officer shouted through a megaphone. The men skidded to a halt, raising their hands. It all happened so fast after that. The officers swarmed out of their cars, guns drawn. They ordered the men to the ground and cuffed them. I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was seeing. One of the officers approached me. "Are you all right, son?" he asked. I nodded mutely. "We got an anonymous tip about some suspicious activity here. Did these men do anything or say anything threatening to you?" I shook my head. No, I stammered. "They were just looking around the store, but something felt off about them." The officer nodded grimly. "Your instincts were right. We're going to need to ask you some questions." As we talked, I saw other officers searching the men's car. Suddenly there was a commotion. "Holy shit," one of them exclaimed. "You guys need to see this." They popped the trunk open wider, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The trunk was full of coils of rope, duct tape, zip ties, and what looked like several guns wrapped in cloth. "Jesus Christ," the officer I was talking to muttered. He turned to me. "Looks like you had a close call, kid. These guys were definitely up to no good." The reality of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. If the police hadn't shown up when they did, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. To me, or to whoever those men were planning to target. The rest of the night was a blur of giving statements and answering questions. By the time I was done, the sun was coming up. My manager had shown up and told me to take the next few days off. I was more than happy to oblige. I couldn't sleep for days after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men's faces. I kept imagining what they might have done if the cops hadn't come. Would they have robbed the store? Kidnapped me? Worse? The police wouldn't tell me much, but I gathered from the news that the two men were wanted in connection with several home invasions and assaults in the area. They think the anonymous tip came from someone who recognized them from the news. I'm beyond grateful that nothing worse happened that night, but I can't shake the feeling of violation and fear. That gas station had always felt safe to me, boring even. Now I see danger lurking around every corner. I jump at every unexpected noise. I'm terrified of being alone at night. I know I should probably talk to a therapist or something, but for now, I'm just trying to process it all. I keep replaying that night over and over, wondering if there were signs I missed or things I should have done differently. The world feels like a much scarier place now. I always thought stuff like that happened to other people, not to me. Now I know how quickly things can go wrong, even in the most mundane settings. I don't think I'll ever take my safety for granted again. I'm not sure what else to say. I guess I just needed to get this off my chest. If you've read this far, thanks for listening. And please, always trust your gut. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. Stay safe out there. I still remember that Christmas Eve like it was yesterday, even though it's been years now. I was spending the holidays alone at my cabin in the woods, about an hour outside of town. My family was scattered across the country, and I'd decided to just have a quiet Christmas to myself that year. It had been snowing heavily all day, blanketing everything in white. As night fell, I settled in by the fireplace with a mug of hot cocoa, enjoying the peaceful silence. Around 10 p.m., I decided to step out onto the porch for a moment to take in the snowy night scene. That's when I first noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to my porch. At first, I thought maybe it was just leftover tracks from when I'd gone to get firewood earlier. But these were clearly different. They came from the woods and stopped right at my front steps. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere on Christmas Eve? I scanned the tree line but saw nothing in the darkness. Trying to shake off my unease, I went back inside and double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. I had trouble falling asleep that night. Every creak of the old cabin made me start. I kept imagining I heard footsteps outside. Around 2 a.m., I finally drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, Christmas Day, I woke up late, feeling groggy and on edge from my fitful night. As I stumbled to the bathroom, still half asleep, something made me freeze in my tracks. There on the hardwood floor were unmistakable wet footprints. My blood ran cold as I followed the trail with my eyes. The prints led from the living room, down the hallway, right up to my closed bedroom door. With trembling hands, I slowly opened the door and peered inside. The footprints continued to the foot of my bed, where they ended. Someone had been in my room while I was sleeping. I frantically searched the cabin but found no sign of an intruder. Nothing seemed to be missing or disturbed. But those footprints were real. I wasn't imagining things. I called the local sheriff's department in a panic. When the deputy arrived about 30 minutes later, he did a thorough search of the property. He found where someone had jimmied open a window in the living room to get in. There were more footprints outside in the melting snow, circling the cabin multiple times. It looked like someone had been watching the house, maybe for days. "Probably planning a Christmas burglary," the deputy said. "Good thing you were home. Must have spooked 'em off." But if that was true, why did they come into my room? Why stand there watching me sleep? The thought made my skin crawl. The deputy took some photos and dusted for prints, but ultimately there wasn't much they could do. No witnesses, no security cameras out here in the woods. He advised me to stay with friends for a few days if I could, just to be safe. I nodded numbly, still in shock. As soon as he left, I threw some clothes in a bag and got the hell out of there. I ended up staying at a hotel in town for the next week, jumping at every sound. When I finally worked up the courage to return to the cabin, everything seemed normal. No more footprints, no signs of disturbance. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. I put the place up for sale a month later. To this day, I have no idea who was in my house that night or what they wanted. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was all just a vivid nightmare brought on by spending Christmas alone. But then I remember those wet footprints leading to my bed, and the terror comes flooding back. I still can't stand to be alone on Christmas Eve. The sound of footsteps in snow makes my heart race, and I always double-check the locks before going to bed. Whoever or whatever came into my home that night is still out there somewhere. And every year when the holidays roll around, I wonder if they're thinking of me too. I know this sounds crazy. Trust me, I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to find some logical explanation. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. And not knowing why it happened or if it could happen again is the scariest part of all. Sometimes I find myself obsessively checking for footprints whenever it snows. I've installed every security system and motion sensor known to man. But deep down, I know that if someone really wants to get in, they'll find a way. The police never found any leads, no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. It's like my nighttime visitor was a ghost, which almost would have been preferable to knowing there was a flesh and blood person in my home, inches away from me as I slept, with who knows what intentions. I've tried therapy, meditation, even hypnosis to try to recover any repressed memories from that night. But there's nothing there beyond what I already remember. Just those footprints and the bone-deep certainty that someone was watching me. Friends have suggested it could have been a homeless person looking for shelter from the cold, but that doesn't explain the days of surveillance beforehand, or why they left without taking anything, or how they managed to get in and out so stealthily. I've spent countless hours imagining scenarios, trying to make sense of it all. Was it a burglar who got cold feet? A stalker? Some sick Christmas-themed prank? But none of the explanations quite fit. All I know for sure is that my sense of safety was shattered that night. Home doesn't feel like home anymore. Christmas has lost its magic. And worst of all, I'm left with this constant, gnawing fear that it could happen again at any moment. I keep telling myself that it's been years, that lightning doesn't strike twice. But then I remember those footprints in the snow, leading out of the woods and right to my door. And I wonder, what if they decide to come back and finish whatever they started? So I remain vigilant, always watching, always listening, never fully relaxed, even in my own home. Because once you've had a stranger in your bedroom while you slept, blissfully unaware, well, you never really feel safe again. I'm sharing this as a warning, I suppose, to remind people to be careful, especially around the holidays when you might let your guard down. Lock your doors, check your windows, and if you see mysterious footprints in the snow, don't ignore them like I initially did, because you never know who might be out there in the dark, watching and waiting for their chance to slip inside while you sleep. And once they've crossed that threshold, there's no going back. The invasion isn't just of your home, but of your peace of mind. And that, I've learned, is the hardest thing of all to recover. I'd been working at Tony's Pizza for about 6 months, mostly doing deliveries on weekends to make some extra cash while in college. It was a pretty chill gig. Cruise around town, listen to music, drop off some pies. Nothing too exciting. That Friday night started off normal enough. It was getting late, around 11 p.m., when an order came in for a house way out on the edge of town. I didn't think much of it at the time. Rich folks often lived out in those secluded areas, and they tipped well. As I drove out there, the houses got further and further apart. The street lights became fewer and farther between, until I was driving down a pitch-black country road, my headlights the only illumination. I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. When I finally pulled up to the address, I saw a run-down old farmhouse set back from the road. Paint was peeling off the siding, and weeds had overtaken what used to be the front yard. A single dim porch light cast eerie shadows across the property. I sat in my car for a moment, debating whether I should just turn around and leave. But I needed this job, and I didn't want to get fired over refusing a delivery. So I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizza, and walked up to the front door. I rang the bell and waited, glancing nervously over my shoulder at the dark woods surrounding the property. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. A woman who looked to be in her 50s peered out at me. She had stringy gray hair and wore a ratty old bathrobe. "Pizza delivery," I said, forcing a smile. The woman's eyes darted around, not quite meeting my gaze. "Oh yes, of course. Please come in while I get my purse." Every instinct was screaming at me not to enter that house, but I didn't want to be rude. I hesitantly stepped inside. The interior was just as run down as the outside. Peeling wallpaper, stained carpets, a musty smell hanging in the air. The woman shuffled off towards what I assumed was the kitchen. "Make yourself comfortable," she called over her shoulder. "I'll just be a moment." I stood awkwardly in the entryway, pizza box in hand. As the seconds ticked by, I became increasingly uneasy. Something about this whole situation felt very, very wrong. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching on gravel outside. I peered out the window next to the door, and my blood ran cold. A man was crouched next to my car, doing something to the tires. Panic surged through me. This was a setup. They were trying to disable my car so I couldn't leave. I turned to bolt out the front door, but the woman suddenly reappeared, blocking my path. "Going somewhere?" she asked, her voice taking on a sinister edge. I forgot something in my car," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. She took a step towards me. "I don't think so, sweetie. Why don't you hand over that pizza, and we'll have ourselves a nice little chat?" In that moment, pure survival instinct took over. I shoved the pizza box into her face and ran. I heard her shriek behind me as scalding hot cheese stuck to her skin. I burst out the front door and sprinted towards my car. The man who had been crouched by the tires straightened up, startled by my sudden appearance. He was holding a knife. "Hey!" he shouted, lunging towards me. I swerved to avoid him, nearly losing my footing on the gravel driveway. Instead of trying for my car, I veered off into the woods bordering the property. Branches whipped at my face as I ran blindly through the darkness. I could hear shouting and crashing sounds behind me as they gave chase. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to get as far away from that house as possible. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sounds of pursuit faded away. I slowed to a walk, gasping for breath. The woods were eerily silent except for the pounding of blood in my ears. I wandered aimlessly, hopelessly lost in the pitch-black forest. My phone was still in the car, so I couldn't call for help or use the GPS. Terror gripped me as I realized I might die out here, alone in the dark. Just as despair was starting to set in, I saw a faint glow through the trees. Praying it wasn't those psychos with flashlights, I cautiously made my way towards the light. To my immense relief, I emerged onto a road. In the distance I could see the lights of a gas station. I practically ran there, bursting through the doors and startling the sleepy-looking cashier. "Please," I gasped out. "I need help. Someone tried to attack me. Can I use your phone to call the police?" The cashier's eyes widened as he took in my disheveled appearance, clothes torn, scratches on my arms and face from the branches. He quickly handed me the store phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. When the 911 operator answered, I frantically explained what had happened. They assured me they were sending officers to my location right away. As I waited for the police to arrive, The adrenaline started to wear off, and the full weight of what I'd just experienced hit me. I slumped to the floor, my whole body trembling. The cashier kindly brought me a bottle of water and a blanket from his car. When the cops finally showed up, I gave them a statement and described the location of the house as best I could remember. They seemed skeptical at first, but must have seen the genuine fear in my eyes. A few hours later, as I sat in the police station giving a more detailed report, an officer came in with news. They had found the house based on my description and arrested a couple matching the description I gave. Apparently, they were wanted in connection with several other robbery and assault cases in the area. The officers praised me for managing to escape and said I'd likely saved myself from becoming another victim. But even knowing those people were in custody, I still felt shaken to my core. I quit my delivery job the next day. For weeks afterwards, I had nightmares about being chased through those dark woods. I still get anxious whenever I have to drive on isolated country roads at night. Looking back, I'm amazed I managed to get away. If I hadn't noticed that man by my car when I did, who knows what might have happened to me in that house. I shudder to think about it. I don't know what those people's ultimate plan was. Robbery, kidnapping, or something even worse. And I'm glad I never had to find out. All I know is that I'll never take my safety for granted again. You never know when a routine night might turn into a fight for your life. I arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon. There was a heavy blanket of snow on the ground, at least a foot deep. As I trudged through it to unload my truck, I noticed some odd tracks in the snow near the cabin. They looked almost like footprints, but were much larger and had a strange shape to them. At the time, I didn't think too much of it. Probably just some local wildlife, I figured. I got settled in and spent the rest of the daylight hours doing some ice fishing out on the frozen lake. As the sun started to set, I packed up my gear and headed back to the cabin. That's when I got my first real hint that something wasn't right. I had this feeling of being watched as I walked back. You know that prickly sensation on the back of your neck? It was like that, but 10 times stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, peering into the darkening woods, but couldn't see anything. Still, I quickened my pace and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling as I started a fire in the wood stove and got dinner going. But I couldn't quite relax. Every little creak or groan of the old cabin made me jump. I found myself constantly peeking out the windows into the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. Around 9 p.m. I was sitting by the fire reading when I heard it, a distinct crunching sound in the snow outside, like footsteps. My heart started racing. I put down my book and crept over to the window, straining my eyes to see through the frosty glass. That's when I saw it, a tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. It was hard to make out details in the darkness, but the shape looked vaguely human-like, only much larger. As my eyes adjusted, I could see it was staring directly at the cabin, at me. I ducked away from the window, my mind reeling. What the hell was that thing? A bear, maybe? But it had been standing upright, and the shape was all wrong. I grabbed the old hunting rifle we keep at the cabin and loaded it with shaking hands. Part of me wanted to run out to my truck and get the hell out of there. But the rational part of my brain said that was a terrible idea. If that thing was still out there, I'd be completely exposed. So I hunkered down, keeping the rifle close. I turned off all the lights except for a small lantern, hoping to make it harder for whatever was out there to see inside. For the next couple hours, I sat in tense silence, straining my ears for any sound of movement outside. Just as I was starting to think, hope, that I had imagined the whole thing, I heard heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. They were moving around the perimeter of the cabin, circling it. My hands were sweating as I gripped the rifle tighter. The footsteps paused near the back of the cabin. Then I heard a scratching sound, like claws or nails dragging across the wooden siding. I was terrified, but also felt a morbid curiosity. I had to know what this thing was. Gathering my courage, I crept over to the rear window and slowly pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. The creature was hunched over right outside the window, its face mere inches from the glass. In the dim moonlight, I could make out matted fur or hair covering most of its body. But its face, God, its face. It was like a twisted parody of a human face, elongated jaw, sunken eyes that reflected red in the darkness, and rows of sharp teeth bared in a grotesque grin. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew true terror. It let out a blood-curdling shriek and slammed its fists against the window. The old glass cracked, but somehow held. I scrambled backwards, nearly pissing myself in fear. The thing started throwing its bulk against the side of the cabin, making the whole structure shake. I could hear wood splintering as it tore at the walls and window frames. It was trying to get in. Panic took over, and I ran for the front door, rifle forgotten. I burst out into the freezing night in just my thermals and boots, sprinting for my truck. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood behind me told me the creature had gotten inside. I fumbled with my keys, dropping them in the snow before finally getting the truck door open and practically diving inside. As I turned the key in the ignition, I saw the thing emerge from the cabin. Even hunched over, it had to be at least 8 feet tall. The truck roared to life, and I slammed it into drive, tires spinning in the snow before finally finding purchase. I fishtailed out of the clearing and onto the narrow access road, heart pounding in my chest. In my rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of the creature. It was standing in the middle of the clearing, silhouetted against the burning cabin. Wait, burning? In my panic, I must have knocked over the lantern, setting the old wooden structure ablaze. I white-knuckled it down that mountain road, expecting at any moment to see the monster come charging out of the woods after me. But nothing happened. After about 30 minutes of terrified driving, I finally reached the main highway and felt like I could breathe again. I drove straight through to the next town and got a motel room. Didn't sleep a wink that night, or for several nights after, if I'm being honest. I was too afraid to go to the police. Who would believe such an insane story? It's been a few months now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've done some research, trying to find any similar encounters or local legends that might explain what I saw. But I've come up empty. Part of me wonders if I imagined the whole thing. Some kind of stress-induced hallucination, maybe. But then I look at the deep scratches on my truck's door from where I scrambled to get in, and I know it was real. I don't know what that thing was or why it was there. Some kind of undiscovered creature, an escaped experiment. I'll probably never know for sure. All I know is that I'm never going back to those woods again. And I suggest you stay far away too, if you know what's good for you. I'm a college student, and this past holiday season I decided to stay at my parents' house while they went on a cruise. I thought it would be nice to have some quiet time to myself, catch up on some reading, and enjoy the peaceful suburban neighborhood where I grew up. Boy, was I wrong. It was around 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve. I was curled up on the couch with a book, enjoying the twinkling lights on our Christmas tree, when I heard what sounded like footsteps crunching through the snow outside. At first I didn't think much of it, probably just a neighbor out for an evening stroll. But then I heard a loud thud against the side of the house. My heart started racing. I peered out the window but couldn't see anything in the darkness. Then I heard another thud, this time definitely coming from the back of the house. Panic rising in my chest, I crept towards the kitchen to look out the back door. That's when I saw him. A man, probably in his 40s, dressed in ragged clothes, standing in our backyard and staring directly at me through the glass door. His eyes were wide and unfocused. He was holding something in his hand. It looked like a large rock. I stumbled backwards, fumbling for my phone to call 911. As I was dialing, I heard a deafening crash as he hurled the rock at the door. The glass didn't shatter completely, but it spiderwebbed with cracks. "Police, what's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. I could barely get the words out as I heard another crash, this time from the living room window. "There's a man attacking my house," I choked out between panicked sobs. "He's throwing rocks at the windows. Please hurry." The dispatcher tried to keep me calm as she said officers were on the way, but I was in full panic mode. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my parents' bedroom, which seemed like the safest place. I could hear more crashes and thuds coming from downstairs. Then everything went quiet. Too quiet. Had he gotten inside? Was he creeping up the stairs right now? I held my breath, straining to hear any sound of movement. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, I heard sirens in the distance. Thank God. But would they get here in time? The sirens got closer, and then I heard car doors slamming outside. "Police, is anyone home?" a voice called out. Shaking, I made my way downstairs. 2 officers were shining flashlights through the shattered front window. I opened the door and practically fell into their arms, sobbing with relief. They did a thorough search of the house and property, but found no sign of the man. However, the damage he'd done was extensive. Nearly every ground floor window was cracked or completely smashed. There were dents in the siding where he'd thrown rocks. The back door was hanging off its hinges. As I gave my statement to one of the officers, I couldn't stop shaking. "Did you recognize this man? Had you ever seen him before?" she asked. That's when I remembered. Earlier that day, I'd gone for a walk in the woods behind our neighborhood. There was a man standing off the path, watching me as I walked by. At the time, I'd written it off as just a homeless guy taking shelter in the woods, but now I was certain it was the same man who'd attacked the house. I think I saw him in the woods earlier," I stammered, "but I don't know who he is or why he'd do this." The police increased patrols in the neighborhood that night, but they never found the man. They said he was probably just some mentally unstable homeless person who'd fixated on our house for some reason. But that explanation doesn't sit right with me. Why our house specifically? Why on Christmas Eve? And how did he disappear so quickly when the police arrived? It's been almost a year now, and I still have nightmares about that night. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. My parents have since installed an expensive security system, but I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe in that house again. Sometimes I wonder if there was more to it, if maybe he was trying to send some kind of message. But what kind of message involves terrorizing someone and destroying their home? I've replayed that night over and over in my head, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Should I have tried to confront him? Should I have left the house entirely? The rational part of my brain knows there's nothing more I could have done. But the memory of those terrifying moments, seeing his crazed eyes through the glass, hearing the windows shattering around me, still haunts me. I'm sharing this story as a reminder to always be aware of your surroundings, even in places you think are safe. You never know when a seemingly normal day can turn into your worst nightmare. I'm trying to move on with my life and not let fear control me. But a part of me will always be that terrified girl huddled in a dark room, listening to the sound of her home being destroyed by a madman on Christmas Eve. If anyone has had a similar experience or has any insights into what might have motivated this man, I'd be grateful to hear them. Writing this out has been cathartic, but I still have so many unanswered questions. I'm not sure I'll ever truly understand why this happened to me. For now, all I can do is be grateful that I survived that night physically unharmed, even if the emotional scars may never fully heal. And I'll never take my sense of safety for granted again. I'd been on the road for hours, fighting against the worsening blizzard. The snow was coming down so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of my car. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, trying to keep control on the increasingly treacherous roads. As night fell, the temperature plummeted, and ice started to form on my windshield. I knew I needed to find somewhere to stop soon, or I'd be in real trouble. That's when I saw it, a faint neon sign glowing in the distance through the curtain of snow. As I got closer, I could make out the word motel flickering dimly. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I'd found salvation from the storm. I pulled into the empty parking lot, the headlights of my car illuminating a rundown building that had clearly seen better days. Paint was peeling off the walls, shutters hung crookedly from windows, and weeds poked up through cracks in the pavement. It didn't look like much, but at that point, I would have taken any shelter I could get. As I put the car in park, I noticed there were no other vehicles around, no lights on in any of the rooms either. An uneasy feeling started to creep over me. Where was everyone? Surely other travelers must have stopped here to escape the storm too. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, debating whether to go check it out or keep driving. That's when I saw them, 2 men emerging from the shadows near the office. They were bundled up against the cold, but I could see their eyes locked onto my car as they started walking towards me with purpose. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. These guys didn't look like motel staff or fellow travelers. There was something predatory in the way they moved, like wolves closing in on wounded prey. My heart started racing as they got closer, and I could make out more details. One was tall and lanky, the other shorter but stocky. Both had thick beards and wild, unkempt hair. The shorter one was carrying something long in his hand, a crowbar or tire iron maybe. I knew I had to act fast. As they reached the front of my car, I threw it in reverse and gunned the engine. The tires spun on the icy pavement for a terrifying moment before finding purchase. I saw the men's eyes go wide with surprise as I started to move. The tall one lunged for my door handle, but I was already sliding backwards. He lost his footing on the slick ground and went down hard. His partner swung the metal bar at my rear window, but missed as I accelerated away. Throwing the car into drive, I fishtailed wildly as I tried to get traction to speed out of the lot. In my rearview mirror, I saw the 2 men sprinting after me, shouting something I couldn't make out over the roar of my engine and the howling wind. I fishtailed again as I hit the main road, nearly sliding into a ditch. Somehow I managed to straighten out and put my foot to the floor. The old car groaned in protest but picked up speed. Soon the flickering motel sign faded into the white void behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep the wheel straight. What the hell had just happened? Who were those men and what did they want? I shuddered to think what might have occurred if I'd gotten out of the car or if they'd managed to get to me before I drove off. For the next hour, I drove in a panic, constantly checking my mirrors for headlights following me. The rational part of my brain knew there was no way they could have caught up in this weather, but terror kept me scanning the road behind me. Eventually, I reached a small town and found an actual open motel with other cars and people around. I was still so shaken I could barely speak to the clerk as I got a room. I triple-checked the locks and pushed a chair against the door before collapsing on the bed, utterly drained. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those men coming for me out of the darkness. My mind raced with what-ifs. What if I hadn't been able to drive away in time? What if they'd managed to smash my window or force my door open? I was convinced I'd narrowly escaped being the victim of a violent crime. The next morning, after the storm had passed, I reported what happened to the local police. They took my statement but didn't seem too concerned. Said there were no reports of any trouble at motels in the area. Suggested maybe I'd imagined it or exaggerated due to the stressful driving conditions. But I know what I saw. Those men were real, and they meant to do me harm. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that night. The glowing sign appearing out of the snow, those predatory eyes locked on me, the sound of metal striking glass as I sped away. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe they were just desperate people looking to rob a traveler. Or perhaps squatters angry at having their makeshift shelter disturbed. But deep down, I'm convinced their intentions were far worse. I'll never know for sure what I escaped that night, but the experience changed me. I'm much more cautious now, especially when traveling alone. I'm hyper-aware of my surroundings and trust my instincts when something feels off. That decrepit motel in the middle of nowhere could have been the scene of my demise. Instead, it serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly a routine trip can turn into a fight for survival. I'm grateful every day that I was able to drive away, but part of me will always wonder about those men, and if they're still out there waiting for their next victim to appear out of the snow. As I pulled up to the dimly lit gas station, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. The place was completely deserted, not a single car at the pumps or in the parking lot, just empty darkness all around. I double-checked the address, hoping I'd made a mistake. But nope, this was definitely the right place. I sat in my car for a few minutes, debating whether to just cancel the order and head home. But I really needed the money, and my rating would take a hit if I bailed. So I took a deep breath, grabbed the food bag, and stepped out into the chilly night air. The fluorescent lights above the gas pumps flickered ominously as I walked towards the small convenience store attached to the station. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. I peered through the grimy windows, but couldn't see anyone inside. The open sign was lit up, though, so I pushed open the door, wincing at the loud chime that announced my entrance. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared in the empty store. "I have a food delivery for, John?" No response, just the quiet hum of the refrigerators. I walked further into the store, past aisles of snacks and drinks. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Where was the employee? Where was the customer? This whole situation felt so wrong. That's when I heard the rumble of an engine outside. Relief flooded through me. Finally, another person. I hurried back towards the entrance, ready to get this delivery over with. But as I reached the door, my blood ran cold. A massive red pickup truck had pulled up right in front of the store, blocking my car in. The headlights were blinding, and I couldn't make out the driver. But I had a horrible feeling this wasn't my customer. I ducked down behind a display of chips, trying to stay out of sight. The truck's engine cut off, and I heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Heavy footsteps approached the store. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place. The door chimed. I held my breath, pressing myself flat against the floor. The footsteps entered the store, slow and deliberate. They paused for a long moment. "I know you're in here," a deep voice growled. "Come on out. I just want to talk." Yeah, right. There was no way in hell I was showing myself. I stayed silent, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps started moving again, coming closer to my hiding spot. I could see the man's legs now, dark jeans and heavy work boots. He was methodically checking each aisle. My mind raced frantically. There had to be a back exit, right? Most stores had one. If I could just slip out without him noticing. I started inching backwards, trying to stay low. But in my panic, I accidentally knocked over a bag of chips. The loud crinkle might as well have been a gunshot in the silent store. The footsteps immediately turned and charged towards me. I leapt to my feet and ran, knocking over displays in my desperation to get away. I could hear the man right behind me, his heavy breathing getting closer. I spotted a employees-only door and threw myself at it, praying it wasn't locked. By some miracle, the handle turned and I tumbled through into a dimly lit back room. I slammed the door shut behind me, fumbling for a lock. There wasn't one. I looked around wildly. The room was small, filled with boxes and supplies, and there, on the far wall, a back exit. I sprinted for it as I heard the man burst into the room behind me. My hands shook as I tried to open the door. It was stuck. I threw my whole body against it, sobbing in terror. Finally, it burst open, and I stumbled out into the night. I ran blindly across the empty lot behind the store, the man's footsteps pounding after me. My lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I had no idea where I was running, just away from that monster behind me. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I realized I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. I risked a glance back and saw no sign of the man. Had I lost him? I slowed to a stop, gasping for air. I was in some kind of wooded area now, surrounded by dark trees. My phone was still in my car, so I had no way to call for help. I was completely lost. For a moment, I considered just collapsing there on the ground and giving up. But then I heard a distant engine rev and saw headlights sweep across the trees. The red truck. He was still looking for me. Terror gave me a fresh burst of energy, and I took off running again. I had to find a main road or a house, somewhere I could get help. I crashed through bushes and stumbled over roots, branches whipping at my face. Finally, mercifully, I saw lights up ahead. As I got closer, I realized it was a small gas station, a different one from where this nightmare started. I burst out of the trees and sprinted across the parking lot. An older man was outside, about to get in his car. I must have looked absolutely insane, wild-eyed, covered in dirt and scratches, gasping for air. But bless that man, he didn't hesitate when I begged him to help me. He ushered me into his car and peeled out of the lot, just as I saw the red truck emerge from the trees. The kind stranger drove me straight to the police station, where I spent hours giving my statement. They sent officers out to the original gas station, but of course there was no sign of the man or his red truck by then. It's been weeks now, and they still haven't found any leads. I quit my delivery job immediately. I can barely leave my house, jumping at every sound and shadow. I keep replaying that night in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. Who was that man? What did he want with me? I know I'm lucky to have escaped, but in a way, I still feel trapped, because I know he's still out there somewhere, and I can't shake the feeling that one day I'll turn around and see that red truck again. So please, be careful out there, especially if you do gig work or deliveries. Trust your instincts. Don't go to isolated places alone at night, And if you ever find yourself at a deserted gas station with a blinking open sign, just keep driving. As I pulled up behind it, I immediately got an uneasy feeling. The car was empty, driver's side door left wide open. I called it in and approached cautiously, flashlight sweeping the area. That's when I noticed the footprints leading away from the car and into the woods. They looked off somehow, like whoever made them was stumbling or dragging something. I radioed for backup and decided to take a closer look at the vehicle while I waited. The interior was a mess, clothes strewn everywhere, mostly women's stuff. In the back seat I found a purse, contents dumped out. Driver's license belonged to a Karen Johnson, 28 years old. I ran the plates, and they came back registered to her too. As I was examining the car, the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood up. I had the distinct sensation of being watched. I whirled around, hand on my holster, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and trees swaying gently in the breeze. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I swept my flashlight beam across the tree line, heart pounding. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw movement, just a flicker of shadow ducking behind a tree. But when I looked closer, nothing was there. Backup still hadn't arrived yet. Protocol said to wait, but something told me I needed to check out those footprints. I followed the trail into the woods, moving slowly and listening intently. The sounds of the highway faded away, replaced by the rustle of leaves and snap of twigs under my feet. About 50 yards in, the trail suddenly vanished. The footprints just stopped, like whoever made them had simply disappeared into thin air. I stood there puzzled, shining my light in all directions. That's when I heard it, a soft thud behind me, like something dropping from above. I spun around, weapon drawn, but again saw nothing. My breath came in ragged gasps as panic started to set in. What the hell was going on? I backed away slowly, keeping my gun and flashlight raised. Suddenly, my beam caught a flash of white. Tangled in some bushes was a torn piece of fabric. Looked like it came from a woman's blouse. As I bent to examine it, a twig snapped loudly just to my left. I jerked upright, heart in my throat. "Police, show yourself!" I shouted, voice shaking slightly. Silence, just the wind in the trees. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. I swear I could almost hear breathing, just on the edge of my perception. I started backing away, wanting nothing more than to get the hell out of there. But as I turned to head back to my cruiser, my flashlight beam fell on something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the bark of a nearby tree was a crude face, 2 eyes, and a twisted smile. It looked freshly carved, sap still oozing from the gashes, and below it, 4 words that haunt me to this day. "I see you, officer." I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran like hell back to my car, slipping and stumbling in my panic. I could have sworn I heard footsteps pounding after me, but I didn't dare look back. I made it to my cruiser and peeled out of there, tires squealing. Backup arrived about 10 minutes later. We did a thorough search of the area but found nothing. No sign of Karen Johnson or whoever left those footprints. The car was towed for processing, but forensics didn't turn up anything useful. It's been a month now, and the case is still open. Karen Johnson was reported missing by her family a few days later. We've had no leads, no witnesses, nothing. But I can't stop thinking about that night, about the feeling of being stalked by something I couldn't see. I requested a transfer to day shift after that. I can't handle nights anymore. Every time I'm out after dark, I feel those eyes on me again, watching, waiting. I keep seeing that crude face carved in the tree, that twisted smile. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, those words echoing in my head. I see you, officer. I don't know what happened out there that night, but I know something evil was in those woods, something that's still out there, watching and waiting, and I pray to God I never encounter it again.